Sorry, Robert, I don't hear you.
Is the bell not coming through?
No. Or maybe, oh, I hear your voice. I think it's just you have such a um, sensitive or mic that doesn't pick up outside
It
of your.
didn't pick up the bell? Okay, let me see if I do it here.
It's so weird. I don't hear anything. I heard the blip and then maybe it's a frequency question. Like it it
It's not coming through?
it doesn't
Okay,
pick up.
let me change the microphone for this part and then I'll switch back.
It's very is it compressed is the right.
How's this?
I hear like that's so weird, so surreal. I just hear going cut and then no.
I changed the microphone, it's not picking up differently.
Also not. Is it?
Hmm.
I this is what I hear. It like that's all I hear, and then there's no
There's no bell?
no. It's so strange. I'm waiting for it, and then
It doesn't happen. Wait, let me see if I can
unless you
turn
have
off.
some, or am I going deaf? I don't hear anything.
Okay,
The bell, yeah,
how's this?
nothing. You hear it, obviously. Yeah, now I hear it. Yeah,
You do?
yeah.
Okay. All right, so I'll restart then. It's okay. That's how life works, right?
Yeah.
Fail again, fail better, as Beckett says. Welcome, everyone. Today we have a very special episode. Is my audio okay now?
Mm-hmm. I
Okay,
hear.
so I'm gonna share screen.
Maybe you could. You're okay to switch back to your normal mic.
Okay, I'll do that.
This looks amazing.
Yeah, so I put together this slideshow that Ayoto hasn't seen before, and there's a reason for it. It's kind of part of the pedagogy. I'll get into that in a second. Let me just see if I can adjust the sound. Settings, audio. Okay. Now I'm back to normal?
Mm-hmm. You sound
Okay.
great.
Okay, so the title of the presentation is The Chinese Unconscious, a Lacanian Reading. And the idea behind this was um, I was reading Jacques Lacan's On a Discourse That Might Not Be a Semblance, which just got released. Let me see if I can force the camera to focus here. It's seminar 18, so this is the one right after the other side of psychoanalysis where he introduces the four discourses. So in this one, which was given between 1970 and 1971, Lacan really gets into um, Chinese language and Chinese philosophy and takes it seriously. And I felt compelled to do a special podcast collaboration with Ayoto, um, where we kind of respond and free associate some of the passages from the text, as well as I provided some contextualizations and questions and problematics around that. And again, Ayoto hasn't seen any of this, so it's going to be kind of fresh. And we wanted to capture kind of a fresh, free associative experience here. Um, so this will be really the focus of today, but there's a lot of other things around it. Now, I also brought Jacques Derrida's Of Grammatology here because he's another thinker that I like to wrestle with. This book was published in French in 1967, so a year after the Écrits were published in French. Um, and he offers a different theory of language, a different theory of how to think about a relationship to writing and speech. So for Lacan, obviously, he thinks that speech is primary. Like there's language, and then there's speech, and then writing is an effect of that. And we'll get into those details. Derrida doesn't agree with that. Derrida thinks that speech is already a form of writing, that somehow in our thinking we're already writing, and by the time we're speaking, it's already that's a form of writing. So that's his theory, which is again very different from the psychoanalytic one. But I like to kind of think about it because it's weird and interesting and gives us a different perspective. And I also brought Edward Said's Orientalism. It's a copy I got from the UK because, this book was published in 78. Um, so, um, 8 years, 7 years later after Lacan's seminar. By the way, Edward Said is one of the people that introduced French theory to the American Academy. So he was reading Lacan in French before he was translated, and he wrote many articles in the 70s before Orientalism, talking about Lacanian psychoanalysis and Derrida. So that's something that people don't know about. But in my forthcoming book, I sort of get into that a little bit, his role into introducing French theory, especially Lacanian psychoanalysis. But the reason why I bring this book is because I think what Lacan does in that seminar is that he offers us a non-Orientalist perspective on the Chinese language, the Chinese unconscious, and that's what we'll get into. And um, so that's to Lacan's credit, because Lacan, he gets called a charlatan. That it's all about performance. It's obtruse. It's too complicated. It's too high on the theory. There's too much jouissance in the theory and the words. And there's truth to that. But I think we have to give him credit that actually he took the Chinese language seriously. He studied it, and we'll get into that. And the way he presents it on its own terms. And I think that's really, really significant. So without further ado, we're going to get started. Do you have any thoughts before we move on, Ayoto?
No, I'm excited to go through this, and this is very special because I just, as I was sharing privately to Robert, and there's some family problems with the health, but just a few days ago, I actually had a very good conversation with my parents, and I was bringing some of these concepts because my father actually worked on artificial intelligence from a mathematical side, and my mother is a Chinese teacher, so she's very much involved in understanding and taught me a lot of the importance of literature. And so I was in very bad Chinese, explaining them some of these concepts and bringing together um, algorithm theories and together with Zen and Buddhism, of which they're very much Buddhist scholars as well, and together and also with Chinese literature. And my father was very, very excited by all of what I was kind of sharing with him, and he said it was very, very stimulating. So I'm very excited to see what you have brought to date, Robert.
So just to talk about this slide, obviously we have sort of a Zen monk meditating facing the wall, which is like traditional way of meditating in the Zen tradition. Zen, of course, comes from China. A lot of people don't know. They know it from the Japanese version as Zen, but Chan Buddhism is where it all started. And so we have Bodhidharma, the bottom right, who pretty much started Chan Buddhism. He was an Indian monk that moved to China and began this school of thought, which is basically a minimalist approach to Buddhism. Try to stick to, the bare minimum and just focus on the experience and the meditation and experiencing emptiness, really. Also, this presentation is dedicated to your parents and your mom, especially because of the what they're going through. So I wanted to be mindful of that. On the top right, well, of course, we have the yin yang. I like that. Do you see it moving on your
Yeah,
end?
yeah,
So that's cool because that's how it's supposed to be. It's not supposed to be a two-dimensional image, but it's like actually more like topology. So it ties in really well with Lacanian topology. And it's a very sophisticated model, in my opinion, of sexuation that predates Lacan's theory of sexuation by thousands of years. So, and he acknowledges that. That's the beauty of it, is he does acknowledge that. Like I had this idea already, and then I was reading the seminar and found Lacan actually making that connection. On the left, of course, do you mind reading what's on the left side?
yeah. So that's I also have my opinion just in case, but it's because it's not a sentence, it's the five constant virtues. It's 仁、义、礼、智、信. So do you want to say that what they mean? Or
I'll let you talk about that. Yeah.
so 认is the that's related to, it's interesting because I've got the Lacanian comparisons here too, but 认, these are all, it's single syllables, but they kind
Mm,
of include a whole world and entire philosophies or beliefs
mm,
or teachings. So it's very difficult to just quickly translate. But here it's interesting about the idea of the benevolence as the imaginary ideal ego for
mm,
Ren. And then for E is the kind of super ego imperative, let's say, about duty. The kind of the Confucian subject is
mm,
bounded by E, which is an ethical paradox because duty is never fully attained and guilt persists, but guilt not in a Catholic sense, but rather that's it's and this is also really helpful with Dr. Patberg, the question,
mm.
or the resistance towards translation.
Yes.
In any case, here we are speaking English, so I can give the kind of a quick translation, but just with each one, bear in mind that there is a whole world behind it.
Yeah. And so the three representations here are basically the three big schools of thought that influence Chinese philosophy. So we have Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. So we can't talk about the Chinese unconscious without reference to those ideas and those concepts, and also try to understand them in their original without translating as much as possible. It's a question of transliteration too.
Right.
I've used my Dharma name. My Dharma name is Embodied Practice of the Heart. I've received the 5 mindfulness trainings from Thich Nhat Hanh. So, I've practiced in the tradition of Tien Buddhism, Vietnamese Zen. So I thought it would be appropriate for me to use my Dharma name today for this presentation.
Can you repeat your Dharma name?
So it's Embodied Practice of the Heart. All right. So, without further ado, the show begins. All right. So I think the good entryway is the Great Racist Convergence. So what is the Great Racist Convergence? Um, we have basically different forms of racism converging in this moment, but they have histories. So there's, of course, the yellow peril. That was the term, the phrase used for anti-Chinese sentiment or xenophobia. From a US context, it really comes to a climax with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. Of course, the Chinese were brought in as immigrants and skilled workers in the US for the railroad and other things. And at some point, uh, and we see a repetition of this now. The white population felt anxious and uncomfortable by Chinese presence, and eventually it became a form of legal discrimination because this was a law where Chinese people were banned from immigrating to the US for 10 years. This is, of course, with COVID, we saw a return of that, but there are different spikes throughout. But there's also a lot of overlap with the first Red Scare, with the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. So I'm also using propaganda from the US here, anti-communism, anti-Chinese sentiment, right, Islamophobia. So first Red Scare from 1917 to 1920, second Red Scare after the end of World War II, in the context of the McCarthy era and the Cold War and all of that. And of course, there's the Green Peril, which is behind Islamophobia, anti-Muslim or anti-Islam sentiments. First with the 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, 1990 the collapse of the Soviet Union and the first Gulf War, 2001 the tragic events of 9/11, followed by the War on Terror, right? So this is important as a context because you see it's like those things overlap and they are overlapping very explicitly today. So I sent this to you recently, Bill Maher, who on his show, and he considers himself a liberal, but he's a liberal that's very comfortable cozying up to right-wingers, right? And he said China is the new Islam, right? So that's a pretty loaded phrase, but if you think about it, it's just combining all these different forms of racism and letting them conversion overlap, right? So that's what's happening. We have a picture here. This is also propaganda from the 19th century. A white woman, right, and a Chinese man with a knife in his mouth and gun, and it says the Yellow Terror um, in all his glory. So the Yellow Terror embodied in the figure of the Chinese man who's dangerous and wild and savage, right? And of course, there's a sexual dimension. They're going after white women, right? So there's all of this hysteria and paranoia about demographic shifts and all that. So it's not new story, right? I just wanted to show that a lot of these things go back to the 19th century. We're just seeing the return of the repressed over and over again. I have also an image from Jacques-Alain Miller, the editor of Lacan's Seminar, because he was Lacan's son-in-law, and he's now in charge of the World Association of Psychoanalysis, which I like to also call it's WAP. So I also refer to it as wet ass pussy because it's WAP. But anyways, that's him on the left. He's very Islamophobic. He's very much a Zionist. We'll get into this a little bit, but look at this. He retweeted this image saying "de lire avec intérêt," to read with interest. Islam has always been about sex and women subjugation. Not that very different from the Yellow Terror, right? Same idea. What is this obsession with the savage and their sexuality and all that? Of course, I have my cover my book, Decolonial Psychoanalysis, which was my first book that deals with the question of Islamophobia and its relationship to the war on terror in the U.S. context, and developing this methodology of decolonial psychoanalysis. So I think today's presentation fits really well within this idea of stretching psychoanalysis and trying to look at it from a non-European perspective. And that's the decolonial move. And Enrique Dussel would say that's the transmodern movement. So this is Philosophy of Liberation by Enrique Dussel. I wanted to just give a side note here and I want to hear your associations. So Dussel, and I'm gonna get more into that, but he has this concept of the analectical moment as opposed to the dialectical moment. His theory basically is that the dialectic is a good method. It's a good critical method, of course. You can trace it back to Hegel or even before that to Socrates, but and of course it takes a materialist form with Marx and Engels and Lenin, etc., and Mao Zedong. But the dialectic has a problem, even with negative dialectics, Adorno's negative dialectics, which is it's always situated within totality. So it's always a critique of within totality. It's a way of resolving contradiction within totality. And totality is a reference to basically what we would think of as Euromodernity, and how coloniality is a feature of that, right? So the analectical moment for him is a way of expanding the dialectical method from a non-European perspective. In other words, from the perspective of the global South, Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So it's a really cool concept because obviously it references the analects, right? And that's intentional. So it's analectical in the sense that or ano refers to beyond, so it's beyond the dialectic. It doesn't mean it negates the dialectic; it just expands the dialectic and um, makes it less Eurocentric, in other words. So I think this is a really important concept for us today, and I'll talk more about. But do you have any associations so far regarding the Great Racist Convergence?
I think that's a great title of observation to to label what is happening now. I recently posted this thing about some, and it's not original, but just the kind of observation about how Tesla is not a car company and Elon Musk is not an entrepreneur and so forth. And because, for example, Tesla, they're actually financial instrument and so forth, and Musk is doing a lot of other things, even kind of corrupt political involvement and so forth. But somebody responded saying that I thought it was really interesting, saying that it it's not that's not the problem, because even if Tesla was a car company and if Elon Musk is an entrepreneur, they're still not leftist. And I thought, yeah, of course. But I'm thinking about this because also the same thing with Bill Maher, that on which level are we talking about the issues? And it's just very striking to also observe someone like Miller and the Islamophobia. And I think, and I learned this from you, to really listen almost literally or really carefully what is said. And I think what Bill Maher says about that China is the new Islam, that's a very amazing statement, because it really reveals so much. And I think we are having so much issues where like on which register are we speaking about. And most of the time, I think also because of this kind of analytical mindset and only allowed to be really addressing what is reasonable or logical or what you can control, there are huge swaths and dimensions and worlds that a lot of people cannot bring into their attention in their discourse. So those are the kind of immediate things, but I think it's important to be able to address what Mayer and Miller is talking about, and also like even if it's old, this terrible illustration, but it's still very much the same issue today. We never really addressed it, and we just kind of as this fragility of whiteness when it it's so unstable when their constructs is not going towards what they've built as they believe it's so. And so I'm very interested to see how this continues as well.
Yes, and of course we have to name what it is. It's a metaphor, right? When you say China is the new Islam, in the world of metaphor, you know already that you're in the world of psychoanalysis and you're dealing with the unconscious right there. So that's why I thought it was interesting. All right, gets a bit more complex here. So this is continuing the theme of the Great Racist Convergence, but breaking it down further. So we have the Red Scare, anti-communism. We have the Green Peril, Islamophobia, and the Yellow Peril, Sinophobia. They're all converging because China is the new Islam. China is a representative of communism, but it's also representative of the Orient, the other, the non-European. And now it's basically conflated with Islam as, representing all those things as well. because China is the new Islam, right? So we have Islamophobia collapsing onto Sinophobia, collapsing onto anti-communism. And that necessitates that we think about the question of racial capitalism, how capitalism from its foundation, because like this is the problem with a lot of I think Marxists and leftists is they're not honest about this question, and they think that racial capitalism means like a type of capitalism, but the phrase racial capitalism means that capitalism has always been racial in the sense that you wouldn't have industrial revolution without what is called in Marxist theory primitive accumulation. So you needed to have colonialism first, colonize lands and people, extract resources, enslave people, use them as commodities, and then generate a lot of wealth for a capitalist class. Then after this primitive accumulation over, hundreds of years, then you can have an industrial revolution because you've amassed so much wealth and you have a lot of free time that you can do that, right? So that's why it's not honest to just locate capitalism at the Industrial Revolution moment without taking into account the question of colonialism, racism, and of course you have concepts like manifest destiny, right? That kind of ideology, and how that ties in with Eurocentrism as well, right? And I wanted to mention the myth of the Judeo-Christian tradition here because we hear this term a lot, Judeo-Christianity. It's a myth. It's a myth that was created after World War II. Because the reality is, if you look at the history of, let's say, Christian Europe, if there's such a thing, because Europe is basically a bunch of different ethnicities and nation states over time that fought each other for, for most of their history. So this idea of a unified Europe is kind of an illusion. But Judeo-Christian is even a bigger illusion because it's created retroactively in order to deal with a history of anti-Semitism and a history of Islamophobia. But but what happens is there's a reparation with the Judaic part, and of course there's a negation of the Islamic part, right? And that's why it's Judeo-Christian. It's not Judeo-Islamic Christian or Judeo-Christian Islamic. It's Judeo-Christian only. So Islam is removed from that concept. And of course, this concept is used to say that there's this civilization which represents the West or Europe, and then there's everything else. Everything else being the non-European, right? The other, China, Asia, Africa, Latin America, the global South, etc. So that's an important concept for us to think about in relation to Eurocentrism, but also the question of settler colonialism, especially in Israel, right? It's hard to we have to name that. That's the elephant in the room because we can't just talk about colonialism as a thing of the past. And decolonial scholars obviously distinguish between colonialism as a structure that's material and uh, coloniality as sort of a psychic remainder from that. That's something that we continue to live with, even if colonialism officially has ended. But when we look at Israel, what's going on today in Gaza, for example, we're seeing a live stream of settler colonialism, right? And it's so, in a sense, we do need some distance from it in order to theorize it because we're too close, right? So any thoughts on this? I'm trying to kind of unpack um, this. Oh, and there's one more thing. Check this out. I thought you'd like that. The Great Racist Convergence, but now broken down from a Lacanian perspective.
Mm,
Do you wanna kind of associate to this?
let me just get a hold of this. Right. That's really interesting. That's really interesting because, yeah, oh my God. With Lacanian um, frameworks, it's sometimes it takes a little bit because we're already going, we're right now we're having a conversation and we're looking at the different pictures and the different things. But then as soon as you start having these multi registers, the brain kind of has to, you know,
Recalibrate.
yeah, I need to like turn on the
So let
graphics
me let me
card.
say a bit more. So basically, we have the three registers the symbolic, the imaginary, and the real. So these are the three registers of human subjectivity. Um, the symbolic is the register of language and law. And so, um, and then the imaginary is the register kind of images and imagination. And the real is that register which cannot be symbolized or represented. So we also have J in the center, referring to jouissance. That so I'm kind of thinking about how this great racist convergence is generating this jouissance, which I call in my work mythic jouissance. So this is the jouissance of capitalists. This is the jouissance of colonizers. This is the kind of enjoyment that they get out of all of this racist convergence. The jouissance that they get from anti-communism, from Islamophobia, from xenophobia. Um, and so in a way, it's a way of theorizing how these things are happening. They're not random. They're kind of actually coordinates of a certain form of enjoyment. Okay? That's Eurocentric, that's racist, etc., etc. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, there's of course the position of this is from a Eurocentric position, right? In relation to the convergence of the racist.
Yeah, so this would be describing the racist jouissance of the Eurocentric subject. And we're doing this from a non-European perspective. So we're looking at it, let's say, from the communist perspective, from the Chinese perspective, and from an Islamic perspective. All the things are negated, basically.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So that's what we're doing today, basically. That's the
Hmm.
task, right? Because this is what they're doing. So we
Hmm.
want to do like the other side. So the question now is like, why China, right? Why not? I say China is the solution, tongue in cheek, because as you know, I really did change my perspective on China. I was kind of duped a little bit years ago by this idea that, China is a problem of sorts and, the West is the answer and that kind of thing. Now I see the US as a scam. I see that I just see decadence in the West and Europe, and I see honestly China um, as providing an alternative model. And it's not a perfect model. There is no perfect model, but I'm not as dismissive as I used to be, and I'm much more open to this other way of being and doing things. Now, the reason why I use that phrase, it's just to kind of unpack it. It's a tongue-in-cheek because Said Qutb, who have you seen this documentary by Adam Curtis, The Power of Nightmares? Because
Hmm.
I know you're a big Adam Curtis fan. So in the documentary, he compares basically Islamic fundamentalism with neoconservatism, and he says that he argues that they both basically have the same fantasy structure, even though they're fighting each other materially, right? There's the war on terror. In fact, they share the same fantasy structure, which is a world of nightmares. They both have a nightmarish vision of the world. So anyway, Said Qutb is one of the theorists in the film. He's this um, this guy, Egyptian, who goes to the US and then he finds the US being very decadent in the 50s, when it was a little bit more conservative, but he already found it decadent back then. And he argued that, wow, they're living in ignorance. And ignorance, or jahiliyyah in Arabic, is a reference to pre-Islamic, basically, that they need some kind of Islamic enlightenment. And he went back to Egypt, he said the same thing, that people are living in ignorance in Jahiliyyah, they need Islam. So he had this famous phrase that got repeated by a lot of Islamists: Islam is the solution. Al-Islam huwa al-hal. So I'm kind of saying China is the solution here in a sense. It's a half truth. Like Lacan talks about, the half truths. There's like a half truth, half lie in what we say. So I do believe it's a half truth. I do believe that China is the solution, but I also don't want to seem like I'm some kind of, extremist who's obsessed with China and, not seeing all the flaws and the real dimension, the dimension of that which is unspeakable. So anyways, I'd say disclaimer, this episode is sponsored by the Chinese Communist Party. I put nod there so that people don't get upset with me. But anyways, your thoughts so far.
Yeah, I wonder though the question of nightmares and how our perspective changes, and sometimes seeing it shift in real time. I feel like this month, especially with all that's happening,
Mm,
it's very interesting to see how that gaze, and it's the and really from a Lacanian gaze position of just thinking also about the big other and the perspective in
mm,
general, and seeing as also an accumulation of all the different people on the internet sphere, especially seeing how people respond to things and then how that's changing. But I do wonder as to, you know, not the not the real China, but the symbolic China,
mm.
uh, particularly from from outside of China, how that is understood. And I think there is something to think about. And also, at the same time, the economy and everything like that's it's a it's not necessarily the reverence, but it's still a signifier that is very important.
Hmm.
And I do wonder how that might change again over time, um, if we zoom out of things. But yeah, because
What's the name of the Apple CEO? Is it Tim Cook?
come again, the C
What's
Apple,
yeah, CEO of Apple, is it Tim Cook?
right? Yeah, still Tim Cook. Yeah.
Did you see his recent video where he talks about China?
No, I didn't. What did he say?
So he was asked why did you choose why does Apple choose China for manufacturing products? And he said it's not what you think. It's not because it's cheap. It's not because, it's because they have the best skilled laborers and the best engineers for manufacturing these products. And this is a very important point because part of the Sinophobia is to think China just makes things cheap. Just go to China.
Hmm.
But no, what made China have this kind of progress and this type of alter modernity, if you will, is actually it is really at the level of modernity, is that they are providing an alternative model of modernity that's beyond Eurocentrism and that's very much grounded in science and in some ways in tradition, which I think is a good um, move beyond like Mao Zedong, because Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution was kind of against, Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. But I think now with the Chinese Communist Party, they're kind of a bit more open to this idea of combining communism with capitalism and Taoism. It's all coming together, right? Somehow there's an amazing, like almost like theory of everything that we're seeing play out, right?
Yeah, I worked in China many years ago, as you know, and I'm still unpacking and thinking about sometimes the different perspectives and theories, because I was also working there as an art director and working with different technicians. And there was this one thing that this guy said to me at the time, and keep in mind, I grew up in the West, and I mean, I have also a lot of Eastern values. Um, but he's this one of the technicians said to me, he says, "Well, you have a very Eurocentric perspective." And at the time, I was much more naive and young and unaware, but I was really shocked because I was speaking to him in Chinese. And
Mm,
I didn't see myself as having a Eurocentric perspective. And what's interesting is, in terms of design, in terms of perspective, in terms of how we see things, it's very clear if anybody actually does spend any time living in Asia to see how small, but at the same time, complete different way of perceiving the world, how extreme
mm,
that is. And I think that fear is, I think, is serious because even for myself, right? Like I think, well, God, like if that means that we have to change how we perceive, how we interact, how we navigate, well, if our perspective is going to be subjugated, then I can see where that fear, that potential fear can come from, especially, I mean, to learn to take in a different name of the Father, if you will.
mm.
That's no easy task. That's kind of embedded
Or
in.
the name of the grandfather to reference Fuai.
Exactly. Yeah.
Pepe the
So
Frog.
it's going to be very fascinating to not just in the coming short period, but of course this is like the grandiose desire that if we were gods and we could see and we can zoom out in different time scales, what could be coming if we are not destroying the planet.
Hmm.
what kind of a future is this. This is a really, really intense
Yeah,
change and moment, shifting of tides.
yeah. Well, from a Chinese perspective, we only become gods once we die, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah. All right. So, um, I have a reference here to the book Asia as Method toward deimperialization. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, but it
Yes.
basically argues for a non-Eurocentric or a non-European way of doing things in terms of epistemology, ontology, and methodology. So I'm trying to be more specific today and say, well, not only Asia's method, but China's method. Like what, let's take China seriously and actually think through Chinese concepts and ideas about things. And that aligns again with Enrique Dussels' theory. So I put here a graph from one of his articles. I don't know if it's clear, but he has the modern system on the left here. This is um, what he would refer to also as totality. So another way of putting it, it would be modernity slash coloniality. A lot of people get confused on the left in the West, and I've written about this. They think that being decolonial means being anti-modern. That's a trap. No. Uh, the point is to affirm modernity and reject coloniality. You have to be able to distinguish. So, for example, you love classical music. You grew up playing classical music. That's modernity. Nothing colonial about that. It only becomes colonial when it involves, some kind of extraction or colonization or, expropriation or something like that. But we have to accept the modernity. So I just want to say that because there's an anti-intellectual move of saying, let's not read Freud, let's not read Lacan because they're European thinkers and therefore, no, that's
Agreed.
dumb, honestly. The decolonial move from the perspective, so exteriority basically is the non-European, the global South, right? His point is to create a transmodernity. So basically, that's the kind of the sublation, the Aufhebung, right? That's the analectical moment, is how to sublate Euro-modernity within something larger than it, which is the modernity of the global South, which I refer to sometimes as alter-modernity. So the modernity of China, the modernity of, Argentina, the modernity of Nigeria, what have you. And so that's the idea of seeing it. So this comes from philosophy of liberation, and I already made the reference to how the analectical moment is in some ways grounded in the analects, and it goes beyond the dialectical. And people are interested, check out philosophy of liberation. He does Dussel unpack what analectics are. So I developed this further in my forthcoming book. So I have um, a book that I finished writing. It's in review right now. It's going to be the end of a trilogy that started with decolonial psychoanalysis, was followed with Freud and Said. And so in the new book, I develop a little bit analectical materialism. So, there's the Marxist concept of dialectical materialism. Again, it's good. We want to keep it, but we want to expand it to refer to non-European context for modernity as well, right? So that's the idea of transmodernity. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is really, really helpful. I'm seeing how so much necessity it is. This even goes with that starting discussion about between writing and speech, but there's also the other question of graphic representations and more complex ways of modeling to try to convey philosophical ideas.
Hmm.
So I'm curious how you develop this, and I need to get into these three books here. I would love
Yeah.
to. There's also the question of Neo-Confucian idea
Mm.
and how that works as we move in a continual force with modernity.
Mm. That's basically the project, I think, of the Chinese Communist Party, right? Is how to merge these things and redefine them. So we have this inside joke, right, about Sinoism versus Zionism, right? Um, Zionism is obviously a loaded signifier. For some people, it means positive things. It means Jewish self-determination. For Jewish people to have a nation state, and it's a for some people it's a signifier that represents national liberation. For a lot of other people, it represents colonialism, racism, nationalism, etc. So it's very loaded signifier. Um, and I want to talk about why Sinoism is better than Zionism. Okay. Um, so I'm going to make three arguments, and you'll help me here. This is all part of the China's method, right? Approach. So three arguments for Sinoism.
Mm.
Um, Sinoism is anti-capitalist through its Taoist critiques of materialism and Confucian emphasis on social harmony over profit. So this is, again, if you could remember the great racist convergence, I'm indexing this. Remember, it's anti-communism, Islamophobia, and Sinophobia, right? The three coordinates. So I'm trying to say that Sinoism addresses those three in a sense. Um, it's humanistic. Sinoism is humanistic because it is grounded in Confucian values of benevolence, which you referred to at the first slide, and respect, and most ideals of universal love. Do you want to unpack some of these concepts and on their original?
Yeah. So this is, and this, these days it comes up over and over, and I realize how important this is that also structures my thinking. So here, with regards to Ren and benevolence and Li, respect, and 见爱, 见爱, universal love, this is something that's, it's, wow, there's so much at the same time because even just to think about it, I realize how much our language, right now we're again speaking in the imperial language of English, and all the history and what is connected to that, and how these concepts and the stories that are connected are without the quote unquote the Judeo-Christian concepts and myths,
Mm,
right? So they're very much um, connected to historical um, moments, historical experiences, um, and not even with Buddhism yet. It's just figures and teachings that has happened, and that is in itself is. And when you say humanist, this is also very interesting because it's not even so much about the concern about the life after death, but it's about the people, even though it's ancestors who are dead. But the it's very much on the how symbolically these things are important, and it's about the preservation of these systems. And I think that's also something that I always bring back, which is that even when different civilizations or conquerors pass through China, that it, and this happened also, correct me if I'm wrong, like also within Islam, this is
mm,
like the big misconception that it's not just about might, but it's also the question what happens after a conquest,
mm,
where oftentimes the the people who and this came up with dinner, and this comes up even with European women sometimes very much, the idea that the strongest, the most powerful should lead, right? And there's
mm,
this very simple mind, and this comes of course like the alpha male fantasy,
mm, mm,
but the thing is within excuse me, Chinese culture is that it's not just about the might. It's very much required the intellect and also the collective work
mm,
that is important. So these are just some of the initial responses, but all of these different aspects that comes like the respect, the love. It's not let's say like the love that is brought up in the Christian love, right?
mm.
That's a very
Yes.
different kind of love to
Mm,
the universal love with society, with the universe. And one other name or word that comes up I think about a lot is even the idea the word for nature.
mm,
That nature in Chinese is 自然, but that 自然 is actually the self being.
mm,
So it's within, but also the like the beingness is the nature. So
Mm,
there's
mm.
not this separate concept, but rather it's very much within. So,
So ontology
all
is
of
not
this,
solipsistic like it is in the West.
right.
Mm,
So I really love the chart here because um, as I'm speaking, I can only speak one word at a time, and we can only make sense of the sentences and so forth. But what is important is, I think these charts is that they contribute and they happen simultaneously. And this is the same thing with the paintings, with the
mm.
arts. I started to read about Francois Cheng, one of the
Hmm. We're gonna
colleagues,
talk
and
about him. Yeah.
right, and how much he emphasizes and brings back, and a lot of things I actually know about Chinese art, but it's interesting how that is so important. That brings back down to all the way down to the way that maybe why Bill Maher might say what he says, because we are actually within the West, and the way that the language and the culture is structured, it no doubt creates that kind of conclusion.
Yes. Now I have a theory of why they do this. So in my work, I argue since decolonial psychoanalysis, and I try to return to this argument a lot because people haven't really picked it up. But sexual difference, and we're gonna talk about sexual difference more, but sexual difference, in my view, is grounded in colonial difference. So, the distinctions between different forms of jouissance, phallic versus feminine or other jouissance, is grounded in the experience of colonialism, which is how colonizers enjoyed versus how the colonized enjoyed. And so, in other words, models of sexuality are grounded in that, but that's never spoken of. So, in a sense, that's the unconscious of sexual difference. And the reason why I say this is because when you hear a statement like, China is the new Islam, right? And I showed you the yellow parallel image of the Chinese man and the white woman, and you see the same exact image with Jacques-Alain Miller. Islam is always about sex, right? It's evidence for my point, is that colonial difference is kind of the foundation of sexual difference. And if we don't really unpack that, then we're just, we don't know what we're doing, right? So I'll get more into that, but the reason why I like that graph too is because, kind of similar to my point about the yin yang being a topology that's very complex within Chinese thinking, there's a very sophisticated model. Logic is a big thing in Chinese philosophy and models. So again, what's impressive here is that we have uh, modern systems of thought that are as rigorous, if not more rigorous, than whatever we find in the West. But it's negated. It's a modernity that's negated. And my point about modernity, by the way, is important here because a lot of these ideas are ancient ideas. So how come they're also modern? Well, if you think about it, this whole idea of modernity was comes after the Renaissance, the rebirth of Europe, if you will, which is again also like mythic because is this idea of let's return back to the glory of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, right? Because we had 1,000 years of darkness where the the church dominated and there was just like the Dark Ages. But of course, simultaneous with the Dark Ages, we have the Islamic Golden Age and other kinds of Golden Ages. So the whole point about modernity is a return to the ancients, right? It's a reinterpretation of the ancient philosophy and science, etc. So, in other words, when we look at Lao Tzu or Confucius, or these are ancient philosophers, but they're also modern philosophers. So we have to think about modernity not in this temporal way that it starts at a certain point in time. Modernity has to do with this kind of way of approaching things, which is you have a systems approach that you are able to account for complexity, that you have a sophisticated model that has logic and and that's modernity. That's why we can talk about the modernity of Chinese culture for thousands of years because it's something that, so that's important to kind of put out there. Do you mind reading the names down at the bottom?
Yeah. Yeah, so you have Laozi, Kongzi, and Mengzi. And this is really important. What you brought up, and of course we're moving through very fast, and there's so many points. But just a few is that even let's say Mengzi, or in and this is where Dr. Patberg's work is very important to translate a lot of these things because, for example, Mencius, why is it called Mencius? Because that's the Latinized
Right.
translation. But the here even like the feelings of compassion, feeling of disdain, feeling of respect, feeling of right and wrong, and let's contrast this even let's say with the Ten Commandments, right, where it's a lot of thou shalt nots. And what's really interesting is that uh, let's say these three figures, and again, as Dr. Patberg reminds us, these are not really philosophers, as philosophers didn't exist as a concept
Mm,
or a word. These are people that analyzed, and like you said, there's a very modern aspect, which is not stuck in superstition, actually,
mm,
but rather in a lot of very complex systems of which is still relevant today in terms of governance, in terms of organization, in
mhm,
terms of yeah, it's very much on the societal macro level in terms of economics. So it's not a kind of naive pre-modern way of relating to the world and the universe. And
mhm,
the same thing, I'm sure, within Islam, you can see like the Islamic Golden Age. With any entry to reading the history of Islam or the world history, really, any fool can see how quickly that the world was not just happening from the Renaissance. In fact, that was a lot
mhm,
was theft and rewriting of history,
mhm,
and so and at the cost it's at the cost of human development in general.
mhm.
So this is very interesting to kind of bring up.
So Lacan also recognizes when he returns to figures like Mencius and the kind of figure that he really hones in his seminar, it's because he sees the modernity in his thinking. So he sees the modernity within Confucianism. And what is this modernity? It's basically it has to do with an approach, a sophisticated approach to understanding language and how and what's the relationship between language and reality. So it really boils down to the signifiers, the Chinese characters, and what they point to and what they represent. That's really the sophistication. So not being able to see that and trying to reduce it to religion or something like that is really dumb, right? And say, oh, this is just a religious way of thinking, whatever.
I see you also for the third point here about
The third
Zionism
point. Hmm.
is internationalist and also the concept of all under heaven,
Hmm.
天 this is really important. And even just backtrack a little bit in general, like what we're in the scope of things, what we're discussing, like the 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 signifier of China, right? And
Hmm.
for the fact that again we're communicating English to just kind of say that. But here when we're ascribing all these things and we say China, China, but again, what is China, right? Like China, that
Hmm.
this word does not exist for any of these people, and that's not the conceptualization of
Hmm.
anything. And so when they speak about, for example, for the Chinese, they say 中国, like the Middle Kingdom,
Hmm.
and when we refer to all of these different dynasties and the people from these different periods, it was really a different structure, different world for each one, and their regions' governance was different.
Hmm.
But in general, they were very much concerned, and that started with Qin Shi Huang, the first one to unify the region,
Hmm.
the first one to organize all of that together, and the U.S., for example, they're accusing China that they want to expand, they want to dominate the world, and so forth. But to a certain extent, yes, I don't think that's a secret, but there's a genuine curiosity about the kind of different ways of universalization, but not in the way
Hmm.
I would say is a very Eurocentric way where they kind of as in a Procrustean way to force everybody within things. And you can
Yes.
see that even within, let's say, Chinese medicine, right? They're very much interested to work with you on an individual level and to see how you personally relate to the world and so forth. So this idea of 天下, like everything under heaven, is not to say that it's the opposite of what is the Leonardo da Vinci, like the what is the
Vitruvian Man.
exactly. It's not, this is it's not gendered. It's not this one single
Right.
thing that goes out.
No,
Rather,
that's a great point.
right? So
And Dussel talks about this, like the problem with totality is that this, if you do you see the arrow that's like C going into D,
right,
the problem of the solution always within totality is assimilation. So if you're
yeah,
Chinese, you're supposed to assimilate into German culture and lose your Chineseness, leave it behind. Like you're accepted. Okay, we accept you, but you have to become like us in order for you to be fully accepted. Now, the transmodernity thing, notice it's that it's an analectical move. So it's about accepting the modernity of Europe, right? But also including it within a larger modernity. So it's not trying to assimilate it into, let's say, a Chinese model, but more like saying that you're fine as you are, but you know, the world doesn't just revolve around you. There's a bigger world out there, and in fact, the global south is the majority of the world. So they should have more of a say, and that's why this concept of transmodernity is really important. Of course, as you know, Lacan really unpacks this all under heaven concept in the seminar. We'll get into it a little bit, but the way he kind of reads it from a discursive perspective, he sees like the heaven as kind of like an S1. That's how I'm reading him. So this idea of all under heaven is a way of kind of referring to the subject, the divided subject under heaven, under the S1. So it's kind of again, he's saying that he's reading this as some kind of theory of language, theory of signifiers that's very sophisticated. People might take it literally as saying heaven, but he's saying no, no, the heaven is a signifier. That's the idea. So we'll get more into that. Okay, notes on method, kind of what we're trying to do, what we've been doing. So this pedagogical collaboration between the Kemet podcast and Asian provocation. We'll switch gears between the discourses of the analyst and the hysteric in an effort to question or critique old master signifiers, which are sources of mythic jouissance. So we talked about the mythic jouissance generated from the great racist convergence of xenophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-communism, as an example. We're questioning and critiquing that, but also producing new master signifiers in the divine position of surplus jouissance and other or feminine jouissance beyond the phallic function of totality, Euromodernity, coloniality. This is important to say because what we're doing here is we're not doing the discourse of the university, we're not doing the discourse of the master. We're switching gears between the discourses of the analyst and the hysteric in the way we're approaching this dialogically. So to this end, psychoanalysis is the other side of mastery or ideology. Lacan was against mastery. He only recognized the absolute mastery of death, right? He called death the absolute master. As such, psychoanalysis is on the side of life or living, eros. Now, of course, notice the meditating monk in the background who's like meditating throughout the slideshow. A big part of the Chan Buddhist tradition is to come to terms with your own death, right? With your impermanence. And you're meditating basically to experience that. The emptiness that experiences your own death, right? And so, because that's, we're beings toward death, so you might as well not live life as if that's not going to happen, but actually to face it in a way in every moment and deal with it. So I think that's important here, the kind of connection between psychoanalysis and Buddhism, if you will. The university discourse, particularly philosophy, as it is understood in Eurocentric way, is there to sustain the fake power of the master, who is a semblance of truth. So I want to say a little bit about this. This seminar, as I said, comes right after seminar 17. In seminar 17, he talks about these four positions, the truth, the agent, the other, production, and then he puts different symbols there. And the symbols keep shifting around because we're positioned differently depending on what discourse we're dealing with. The four discourses are not the only discourses in the world. They're just four important ones. And he shifts in seminar 18. Instead of saying agent, he says semblance. So that's in the title. And so semblance is to say that there's truth and there's something that looks like truth, but is not truth. That's semblance. It's something that looks like truth, but it's not the truth. So agent basically, and that's why I say fake power of the master, because the master is basically in the position of an agent. What is the truth of this agent? is their castration, their division, right? Which is what they're hiding. And then in the position of the other, he puts jouissance in seminar 18, and in production, that's surplus jouissance. So that's basically what's left over from this sort of operation. As such, critical knowledge or transpersonal knowing, knowing beyond oneself, is a function of hysteria. So in a way, what we're doing here is kind of we're hystericizing, right? A hysteric invented psychoanalysis as the science of the unconscious. Decentering egocentrism coincides with decentering ethnocentrism. That's kind of the bigger move that we're trying to do here. Um, Thus, the move from Eurocentrism to Sinoism is a world-centric move. That's kind of my transmodern or analectical argument, is that Sinoism, what makes it different from Zionism is that it's not a nationalism, it's an internationalism, all under heaven, right? Any thoughts so far on the, kind of these methodological questions?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the four discourses. I think there's a lot to of course go with, and I was also for myself just mapping out. There's also the discourse of the capitalist,
Mm-hmm.
but I also extended that way of thinking or switching and thinking about the discourse of the racist.
Mm,
And you know, there's also the danger to think about. There's just a lot. But one thing, the most immediate reaction is just thinking about the signifier of the indigenous.
mm,
And, let's say, I think, of course, having a critical way of approaching things, what we must also be able to maintain a level of criticality of the Zionist, and what remains to be repressed within that structure. And I do wonder how that is. I think it doesn't work to just simply use the same ways of critique of Eurocentric kind of and colonial issues onto
mm,
China, onto a Sino perspective. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have its other surpluses or other repressed aspects.
mm-hmm.
And but that I think requires a whole different discourse and a whole different
Yes.
way to analyze.
Yeah, I mean, it has its own contradictions basically, and that's why you still need the analectics to deal with that. But I think from my perspective, the problem of modernity as it exists within totality is coloniality, which that's the negated, the repressed, right? I think again, to oversimplify, the problem with ultra-modernity or modernity in the non-European world tends to be anti-modernity. So there's kind of a conflation of coloniality with anti-modernity, basically. In other words, some people fantasize about a return to anti-modern or pre-modern times as some
Yes.
kind of a solution to modernity, right? Or that's the alternative to coloniality, but that's the trap, right? So, for example, we're going to talk a little bit about ritual and myth in a second, but I'm always against any kind of literalist approach that just is satisfied, let's say, at the level of the ritual only, right? Which means a negation of the unconscious.
And I think that this is a place where I see very commonly a big difference between the so-called global north versus the global south.
Mm,
And not that the people from the global south is inferior or somehow has, a special knowledge because they are so oppressed or so forth, but rather it's the people who are aware of contradictions and people who are not.
mm,
And there's the trap as you remind as well about the naive desire for nostalgic return to any
mm,
forms, right? Either fascism or Greek mythology
mm,
or even fetishizing so-called indigenous cultures. I'm not
mm,
against it, even against Greek uh, um, fantasies or whatever, but rather the the inhabitual relationship of living in contradiction. For example, like if you are in China, or if in any global south, really, it's very common that you would have your mother tongue, but then also very much having to incorporate and learn constantly the contradictions of so-called modern, so-called Western world.
Hmm.
That habit and the extent of it, because sure, you could say like you're from France and you're having to keep up with what's happening in the US, but it's that level of contradiction is not really as extreme as, let's say, people in other parts in the global south.
Hmm. Right, there's definitely Lacan talks about underdevelopment that comes with capitalism. Like it's inherent in its own kind of contradiction. In order for there to be developments one place, there has to be underdevelopment somewhere else. That's how it works. But to add to your point too, I think the point about modernity too, because I destroyed the temporal model, right? But also the point about modernity is that it's about presence. It's about being in the present. What makes Greek philosophy, ancient Greek philosophy modern is that they were thinking about the present. They were thinking about their present moment. There's a difference between seeing that and recognizing that and kind of approaching it in a nostalgic way. Because if we do approach it in a nostalgic way, then we're no longer in the present. We're kind of fantasizing about living in their time. The point is to see what was really modern about their approach. In other words, how did they hit the truth in their moment, and how does that apply to us today? That's what makes it modern. So people who are anti-modern, they don't live in the present. In other words, they either live in the past or the future. Okay. So that's my point here. Okay, so some questions for today. And you did refer to Thorsten Padberg. You've done an amazing lecture series on his work, and you've interviewed him as well. Do you mind going through some of these questions?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Why is Zenren not a master? Yeah. Hmm. The first one, Zenren, and also the question of master. The as a simple example, I remember even a friend, he's Italian man that was studying what is the art in Japan, like this no theater, right? And in classical Asian way of studying, you go find a master. But he shared this experience of when he was learning, it wasn't like this idea of master slave
Mm,
way of dealing with things. Sure, you go and you bow to the master, but the master, he would present something or do something, and the only thing the master would say, no, not it, that's not it, and he will go and do something else and come back, and again the master would say, not it, and it's this constant game of not it.
right.
And so, and here the Zhenren, directly translated, like perhaps like the real person.
Hmm.
And here there is no even any descriptor of any form of relationship with another, with a disciple or something like. And so the idea also that the master slave dialectic, or the two are actually very much codependently existing. Whereas the idea of Zenren here, it's not a master. It's about finding oneself, so to speak, a bit cheesy, but it's a finding that personal reality. Uh, and then
Can I
with
give you my take on it?
yeah, please.
Because you said the real person, and I have that down there, and I wrote it like this.
This is does the position of the analyst coincide with that? Precisely, I think so.
But
The
notice how I wrote real subject with capital R. And I
yeah,
think you
right,
said real person. And I think it really captures that basically mastery has to do with ego mastery. That's usually like ego psychology and identification with the analyst or
exactly.
the therapist. Whereas the Shenren is a real subject in the sense that they recognize their unconscious as if like they've undergone analysis, and their mastery is that recognition. So in that sense, it's the more like the position of the analyst than the position of the master in Lacanian terms.
That's right.
Would you agree with that?
I totally agree. It's the there's also the classic thing of meditating in a monastery, and then the master, so-called master, will come and whack you when you think that
So,
you're
so I
really
wonder if we should start translating it as analysts. That's a question I have. I mean, because master seems to be a mistranslation, right?
right. I mean, the of course the analyst has comes within its own tradition.
Right.
Here the question of the 真, like the real subject,
Oh,
and
real subject. That's another idea I had.
yeah, yeah, the 真人, that is
Okay,
very
what
interesting.
what about the second question?
So with regards to 哲学, and this comes back as a really funny game because let's say, um, just now we were talking about the 真人, and we're thinking about potential labels or translations from the English side. Here it's kind of the opposite because 哲学 is a translation, a conceptual translation. It's not phonetic translation. So 学, the second word, is study, learning, discipline. 哲 means wisdom, sagacity, or intellect. So 哲学, as Dr. Packberg has pointed out, did not exist in Chinese language until around the 19th century. Doesn't
Mm,
mean that the study of wisdom or of sagacity of intellect did not exist. It very much existed.
mm,
They
mm,
had uh, different titles for it, such as what you presented at the very beginning of the presentation.
mm,
And so here, it's interesting because it's a translation, but it doesn't at all connect to the history directly from the word to, let's say, philosophy or philosophia, and the tradition that comes from that, and the politics that comes for that.
mm, mm,
So it's a very fun game here where we're also discussing, okay, Zhenren, is that a master? It's not a master. Okay, is it an analyst? Okay, maybe, but does that then
mm,
really encapsulate the history? And so I think this mistranslation is a fun game, which unfortunately one would have to have good grounding on both sides to be able to appreciate these
mm,
non-translations or
mm.
mistranslations and misrecognitions.
Okay, so this is my next question. Is the Shenren the objet A as the real kernel and truth of the subject singularity of being? This is a way of thinking about that. And also thinking about psychoanalysis as anti-philosophy, right? Because Lacan positions philosophy as a university discourse, right? So for him, psychoanalysis is anti-philosophy. So can we consider the science of the unconscious to be aligned with Zheje? How do you say it?
哲学.
Zoshe. Can it be aligned with Zoshe, the science of wisdom? In other words, is psychoanalysis the science of unconscious wisdom?
Hmm. This is very tricky. And just to clarify, um, because it's these words, especially in the translation, is so close, 圣人 and the 真人 is very, very different in Chinese.
Mm,
So because here we have Dr. Patrick's the book, The 圣人,
right,
and here we're discussing about the 真人. So the 真人 is perhaps closer to I mean, both of them actually are models of ideal persons, right? They
right.
are idealistic for within the Chinese kind of concepts. So the 真人 has also more connections to, let's say, spontaneities, which is 自然, which is nature.
Mm,
The idea of the 无为, so non-action,
yes.
the detachedness, and but also has got these other words, is immortal like. So it's like 神仙. And so, but on the other hand, the 圣人 is someone who cultivates morals and has and abides by rituals and propriety, has governance and leadership, and has social responsibility. So these are somehow similar, but has very specific different implications.
Yeah.
And so the question of psychoanalysis, I do think that psychoanalysis, at the same time, I think, becomes a very important inheritor of the lineage of Western philosophy, but precisely because it is quite anti-philosophical, right? I think
Yeah.
you might agree there. And so um, it's it's very interesting because we're trying it feels like we're having this parallel conversation of what is happening
Mm,
in the trajectory of Chinese thought
right.
and at the same time the trajectory and the lineage of Western thought. Um, and some might have parallels, but at the same time they are completely
Right,
different.
right.
Except
They're different worlds. But I think, I mean, part of it, what I get from it, again, as someone that practiced within a Chan Buddhist tradition, like the idea of enlightenment, again, the West would think enlightenment has to do with knowledge. As in you have a lot of ideas in your mind, you've read a lot, accumulated. It's this primitive accumulation point again of racial capitalism. But but it's more about knowing that there is no self, which is a very paradoxical form of knowing. It's like recognizing your emptiness. And the master, if we call it that, the Shenren in the Asian tradition, is someone that basically, again, to put it in psychoanalytic terms, would be someone that recognizes their unconscious as somehow the kernel of their subjectivity, their lack, the real of their being, right? And as opposed to being tricked by the illusion of egoic mastery, because that would be the opposite, right? And that's why the word master, I think, is problematic as a translation because it's always related to, from a psychoanalytic perspective, it's related to the ego, the thing that psychoanalysis wants to displace, right? Again, can we speak of a Chinese or Asian unconscious from a Lacanian perspective as the discourse of the quote unquote Oriental other? To put it differently, how would a Lacanian reading of the Chinese unconscious be distinct from Jung's concept of the collective unconscious as a placeholder for archetypes from Chinese mythology? And I have the next slide sort of getting to that. This is a little bit of detour. However, the most important question is, can dialectics break bricks? So, do you want to read some of these quotes? This is a situationist film that came out in the 70s. Basically, they used a Chinese film, Chinese kung fu film, and the situationists in France put all these crazy subtitles. It's a fun experience, honestly. Go for it.
I don't want to hear any more about class struggle. If not, I'll send in my sociologist, my Foucault's, my Lacan's. And if that's not enough, I'll even send my structuralist. I'm sick of commodity ideology. You're just like the others, and they're killing us with it. Well, I love this last one. Bureaucrat, son of a bitch. We're gonna cut you up, shit heap, and sooner than you think.
You can
Can
imagine
dialectic.
how enjoyable this is.
So there's a whole
Uh,
film with this. Is it?
this is a whole movie, and I've seen it, and it's so funny. It's so good. But I
That's the
think the
way. That's
answer,
the approach. I think that's the approach, right? To
that's the
have
approach.
to have the. I'm imagining what this film, this art project would be like, but to have the original thing, and we're kind of getting some of this on TikTok or on Instagram, where you have like the original and then another set of translation that might or might
Yeah.
not have anything to do with the original, but
And
you're
this is
reading
way
both at the
before
same
the
time.
Hitler one. There's a famous Hitler one.
Oh
I
yeah, yeah,
know.
that's a
Uh,
great
that's a classic one on
a
the that
classic.
became huge on the internet. Um, it's from what movie? Do you remember the
It's
movie
the
title?
it's the
Bruno
wait
Gantz, right?
yeah um
It's one word title, I think. Um,
downfall.
Downfall. Thank you. So yeah, it's a scene from Downfall where Hitler is pretty much like screaming. He's in a bunker and he's screaming at the generals, and it has been mistranslated for humor many times, and it works every single time. I guess for German speakers it doesn't work because you're hearing the German and it's distracting, right?
Right.
But yeah, in this case, um, Yeah, it's a fun movie. I recommend people watch it. It's unknown at this point. But I think the answer I would say, again, going back to my original ideas, can dialectics break bricks? I would say no, but analectics can.
Mm, mm,
Okay, Jung's error and Lacan's correction.
nice.
So archetypes are phantasmatic objects of the imagination, i.e., they are elements of the imaginary register. This is the error of Jung, is when he looks at the, let's say, the Chinese unconscious, he'll look at archetypes like, let's say, a dragon, and just get fixated on those images as somehow telling us something about the Chinese unconscious. This is the wrong approach. Not that these images are not important, they are, because they feature in art and painting, etc. So they are important to look at, but we can't just reduce it to that. He reduces it to that. However, beyond images from Chinese mythology, we must also wrestle with one, the question of symbolic castration, or the particular ways Chinese signifiers constitute the order of language and law that sets the discursive coordinates of a Chinese unconscious in its specific type of negation. That's one. Two, the question of real impotence, or how lack is structured within the Chinese tradition, giving rise to a divine form of enjoyment beyond the mythic one imagined by Orientalists. Okay? So if we reduce it to the archetype, if we reduce it to the image, we're dealing with Orientalism, we're dealing with the mythic enjoyment of the Orientalists. But if we're able to really look at the symbolic and the real, then we can actually start getting a sense of the Chinese unconscious, I think. And that's Lacan's approach, why I think it's such an important seminar. Any thoughts before we move forward?
Yeah, I was just looking up all these the comparisons between the Sungren and the Zhenren,
Mm,
and how that also implicates in terms of political theory and contemporary political theory, because the two are very different. And for example, here it's saying that the Sengren as the ideal ruler in Chinese political tradition, and this is the current Chinese Communist Party embraces the Confucian Sengren model. So that's a strong, disciplined leader, and forwards the concept of the harmonious society, right? So 和谐社会, so it's just harmonious society that reflects the Confucian stability over radical change. And so we're
mm,
talking about breaking bricks. And so, but for the Taoist, the Zhenren is more of the Taoist ideal, which is the
mm,
subversive, the quiet resistance to power, and
mm,
has a more anarchic tendencies.
mm,
Talks about soft power, so flexibility over brute force.
right.
Um, so, for example, the China's use of economic influence rather than direct war. So this is what's interesting
Yeah.
is that it's not that this is not studied or embraced. It's just that there are these different influences, right? And so this is even
Yes.
like when I'm thinking about, let's say in the US, you have the Democrats, Republicans, you have the right or the left from the French, but these are not the ways in which the approach is understood in China. And so in the modern example, you have this concept of the Tang Ping, which is the lying flat, which is what a lot of the young people are rejecting overwork and embracing Taoist passivity as a silent
Mm,
rebellion.
mm,
Funny enough, I was telling this to a Ukrainian, and he said, "Well, isn't that just CIA propaganda about trying to infiltrate the Chinese? Maybe not. I don't know. Maybe he knows something I don't." But here is also very interesting the way we see how the Chinese diplomatic strategy is unfolding right now, where the West is very much interested in hard power
mm,
and very much forwarding on the military side and also leading in terms of dictating even economic tariffs and so forth. But for the Chinese and even the memes, right? The Chinese is just like, we're winning by
mhm.
not doing anything. Just
Yes,
don't interfere. Don't just let things
I
be.
love it.
And so here again is like it's not so simple of
Right.
how there is a one way in which the Chinese are doing
The
things.
Chinese approach almost seems like a meme. It's like
Yeah,
those memes where you're just reacting to something, but it's like a burn. You're just like
yeah.
it's just all so it's but it's like I guess it's the wiser approach. It's like
Well, they have no
uh
choice, I feel like. I mean, since the two opium wars, they have just been. reacting and just, I mean, they have what they have, and then they've just kind of sitting with it for
Right.
200 years.
Yeah. No, I have to say I'm impressed with the development and I'm hopeful. We've talked about this.
Right.
All right, so overview. All of this, believe it or not, was a preface to so it's a very elaborate preface. I hope that people benefit from this. The point is to stretch psychoanalysis beyond its Eurocentrism to show all these connections. So I hope that folks will benefit from this presentation. So some of the things that will follow this is the overview. Freud versus China, Lacan versus China, focus on seminar 18. That's really the crux of what we're, and I want to kind of emphasize four Chinese Lacanians. So we talked about Francois Cheng. I have something about him, Wu Datong, Fu Wei, and Wu Guanzhen. So those are four Chinese Lacanians. The last three are like active, very active today, especially. This is interesting. At the bottom here, what does it say? The Lacanian book.
I need to translate this too. 1 second. The thing is because you don't know which way to read sometimes, and if you're not
Oh
familiar,
yeah,
it can
where to start?
okay, I think it says what does it say? 算计 oh 算计 okay, so oh Lacan 算计 select the works of Lacan.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Okay,
it's
that's
a
that's Lacan's Chinese name. I see. Lacan 算计. Okay, Lacanian selected works.
so this look at this. This is a Lacanian anthology in Chinese that's selling for $200 on Amazon.
Okay, amazing. Who wrote this?
I don't know the translate. No, this is Lacan, but translated in Chinese.
Wait, so is this like a Cree translated? Or?
I'm not sure. That's why I was asking you. I'm not sure if it's a Cree or if it's a weird collection of things.
So it just says it's the selected works of Lacan. So, but
Yeah,
who?
I got a sense that it's an anthology of his writings, but I don't know if it's a Cree precisely or just a random collection of some of his writings.
How fascinating.
But it sells for $200 on Amazon, so obviously there's a high demand for Lacan in Chinese, and there's a whole black market of Lacanian texts in Chinese.
Supposedly, this is the Chinese translation of the Cree.
It is? Okay.
Supposedly, that's translate. Oh,
So
it's translated by Chu Xiaoquan, published by the East China Normal University Press in October 2019.
isn't that fascinating though? Like the the
But that's
fact that
so
it's
funny that it's so over. It's 200. It's from 2019. Like how rare it can be.
No, but that tells you
Finished.
that there's a high demand. Like like everyone bought it. There's only like one copy or a few copies left,
No,
and
but
there's
I wonder how it is in China. I think after COVID and people have less access to China, I suspect that it's in high demand by people who want to know about the Chinese gaze of Lacan or the West, and I think that's where the competition lays.
maybe. So the Freud Museum did I don't know if you saw this, but they did a special exhibition on Freud in China. I'll begin with that. And then we'll get into Lacan, which will be kind of like the meaty part of the presentation. And then we'll highlight four Chinese Lacanians. Okay?
Amazing.
Freud versus China. So this is a quote from Freud. He said in 1938, all the Egyptians, Chinese, and Greeks have stood up to the journey with very little damage and look more impressive here than in Bergase. So he's referring to after moving from his apartment on the top left apartment in Vienna, Austria, the famous one, where he practiced analysis for many years. But then after the Nazi annexation of Austria, he had to move to London. So on the top right, we have the Freud Museum in London. And of course, as you know, Freud was uh, he loved collecting ancient artifacts, especially from Greece, Rome, Egypt, and China. Those were his four favorite places. So at the bottom, these are actual very expensive items that he collected. Um, so these are all in his special collection. So that shows you like his appreciation of Chinese modernity. in other words. Freud's library contains his own 1930 Chinese edition of his introductory lectures in psychoanalysis, translated by Gao Weifu, and one of the pioneers of psychotherapy and psychology in China. Indeed, Freud owned a number of books on Chinese arts and literature, themselves very beautiful examples of German interwar book art and testimony to the wave of interest in all things Chinese in the Europe of Freud's day. Freud never traveled to China. In an exchange of letters with the philosopher and Chinese translator of his autobiography, Zhang, please pronounce, because I don't want to butcher it.
张世浩.
Freud confessed that his copy of the Encyclopedia Britannica was the principal source on which he based the key references to China and Chinese culture in his writings on psychoanalysis. So that just wanted to touch on that he didn't have like an in-depth relationship with China and Chinese culture, but he was very curious, was very interested and very respectful, and recognized the modernity of China, which is like really, but like Lacan took it to the next level because Lacan studied Chinese, and then went to the level of interpreting the characters. So this is where we go next, really. This is Lacan versus China. All right, you ready for this?
Mhm.
So I have my book here with the notes, because we're gonna take a look at some passages from seminar 18. So let's start with 27. This one, and we were talking about this, over WhatsApp, and I emailed you I texted you rather, some images, because I found, for example, the passage on 27 where he says their intelligence is absolutely prodigious insofar as what is at stake for him. He's referring to Balthazar Gracian, is to establish what one might call the holiness of man. His book, The Courtier's Manual Oracle, can be summarized very briefly to be a saint. It is the only place in Western civilization where the word saint has the same meaning as in Chinese Shangren. And when I saw this, of course, I was like, wow, okay. So um my first question reading this is Lacan seeing himself in the figure of the Shangren, in other words. He puts saint in quotes because he knows that it's not a perfect translation. And we were just talking about that, so we don't have to repeat that point. But it really gets started there, but I think it gets meaty in a few seconds. Any thoughts here?
No, continue, please.
All right, so I'm going to move on to 33, where he's referring to Mencius, and he says, if I know what's what, I still have to say simultaneously um, that I don't know what I'm saying. And so this is a point about not knowing, and that when he was reading Mencius, he's seeing that there's a recognition within the Confucian system of thought of the unconscious. And it's like referred to in terms of like not knowing, basically. So that's why he's impressed with that, because again, Freud didn't invent the unconscious, right? We can even say the unconscious has been invented in the ancient world, which is a modern invention already. Okay, I think that's the point about that. So this is over here. Um, I want to highlight especially 35. He does talk about the yang, which the part of the yin yang in Taoism. So it presents us with a very complex model of sexual difference, wherein his model, where he has like masculine kind of versus feminine, and there's a castration in the sense that you have to choose. You can't be both at once. So you're either experiencing masculine jouissance or phallic jouissance, which he calls the jouissance of the idiot later in seminar 20. Uh, Basically masturbatory jouissance, because it's grounded in fantasy. That the reason why there's this sexual non-rapport is that from the male's perspective, from the perspective, let's say, of patriarchy or masculine jouissance, it's always mediated through fantasy. So there's no direct link to the other or to the feminine. It's always mediated. Whereas the feminine is supposed to be a form of jouissance beyond this kind of simplistic phantasmatic way. That's why it's a bit more mysterious. But for Lacan, it's kind of an either or model, right? Um, Whereas I think the yin yang model, you could say, is non-dual in the sense that there's a recognition that masculine and feminine are going together, and the feminine has masculine and the masculine has feminine. So it's a bit more complex, I think, than Lacan's theory of sexuation, and he acknowledges this. But I think the line that I thought was interesting here on 35, where he says, "If I speak to you about yin and yang, it is because they are examples of unlocatable reference. This doesn't mean that they aren't fucking real. The proof is that we are still weighed down by them." So, in other words, he's referring to them as signifiers, right? And again, in his model, the signifier is more important than the signified. It's not about meaning, but it's about the location of the signifier within a chain and the effect of that on the subject. Any associations on that one?
This is so evident for those who dwell within Chinese that you can see it both, like, let's say, in daily life or in Chinese medicine or in dietary functions as well. But even in you can watch. I used to watch these 武侠小说, like these 武侠, like kung fu kind of film.
Mm,
That it's like a Chinese fantasy, Chinese Lord of the Rings variation. And one of the tropes that always happens, like every other episode, one main character will always cross-dress,
mm,
and but in a way that they will just maybe put on a mustache or a beard or something, or change the clothes, and but it's immediately understood by everybody else within that world that, oh, this person is a different gender,
mm,
and people take it seriously. And the signifiers, I think, is so important to, even for the Chinese. So, like, let's say in English, or Western languages, it's very loaded, right? Like, to say
mm,
something, or phallic enjoyment, right?
mm-hmm,
If people don't know that even if they do know that you're psychoanalytically inclined, you're looking for, it's a bit of a death wish
mm,
to walk around and accuse people of hysteria, or so on. But in Chinese, when you go to a doctor, it's very common, and I don't feel that, oh, for example, they'll, and it's also like other signifiers, like you have too much fire, or
mm,
you have too much shadow or whatever. But of course there are connections, but there is not this like feeling of, oh, God forbid I'm hysteric, right?
mm,
If you apply the kind of misogynistic understanding, or so forth. But and this kind of like need to oh, you must have a real big dick, this whole phallic obsession.
mm,
It's genuinely, there are so many references, and it's a whole world of what these signifiers take on, that
mm.
it doesn't bother the person in the same way, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I would say from a psychoanalytic perspective, it's important to note that hysteria is a positive. So there wouldn't be psychoanalysis without hysteria. Hysteria is what gives birth to psychoanalysis. And so I understand there's history of hysteria being having negative association because, it's a diagnosis specifically for women, in Victorian women specifically. But from a structural perspective, hysteria is the questioning of master signifiers, is the critique of master signifiers. That's really what it is. So that's what analysans do in analysis. So it's a good thing. Usually it could be useless, it could be endless, it could be infinite, but it could also produce critical knowledge. And hopefully that's what we're doing today. We're trying to hystericize in order to critique Eurocentrism and coloniality, etc. The other next big one is the Wei. That's famous from Wu Wei, non-action. So he says that Wei can mean action, but it also could be a stand-in for metaphor or conjunction. And I thought that was interesting. So again, he's saying that Wei is speaks to the metaphorical dimension within the language that has to do with, again, the unconscious. Because once you're playing with figures of speech, a metaphor, and metonymy, you're already pointing towards the unconscious dimension. So it's something that's structural, like in a way that the unconscious is structured within the language this way.
This character, I'm just remembering when I first learned some of these words, as a kid, I remember very much having to repeat and write a lot of these words over and over. And I remember very much this word, but the associations that come is not what is given here, which of
Mm,
course I understand and they are valid. But this is a very common word for me as a kid, is linked to wait some more, which is why. Why is something, and so this is for me also a very hysterical
mm.
concept because it's demanding knowledge from the other. And so the references and the connections is a bit different to my first exposure to this character.
Mm. Okay, so a side note here, I have some classics, as I showed earlier, of Chinese philosophies. I showed Confucius Analects. One of my favorite books is The Secret of the Golden Flower. I
Mm,
want to read a quote from that about Wu Wei.
mhm,
But I also have The Fetish of Failure,
mm.
a contemporary classic
It's so
from,
cool that you can have one there.
yeah. So I want to read to you this. So the original is supposed to be, and again, I'm gonna butcher it, but you'll correct me. Tai Ai Chin Wa Tsung Chi, The Secret of the Golden Flower. And you can pronounce it the correct way if you don't mind.
Wait, I need to see it though.
Um, can you look it up on your end? The Secret of the Golden Flower?
Mhm. Is that just the title?
Yeah, it's a translation of Tai Ai Chin Wa Tsung Chi, but I'm butchering that.
Oh, is it太乙精华宗旨? Is that one?
Exactly. That's the one.
The
Yes, I was.
fundamental doctrine of the golden flower of supreme unity.
Yes, so this book is fascinating because it's supposed to be generated using this technique called spirit writing.
Mhm.
I don't know if you know about it, this technique, but in Chinese culture, apparently a group of people sit together and they channel a book. So it doesn't have one author, but a group are writing it together. And I think the result is fantastic. So I'm going to read to you a quote from here, because I want you to hear, especially this is an ancient text, but like how the unconscious is very explicitly referred to here. So it says, the master is further concerned that people should not miss the way that leads from conscious action to unconscious non-action. Therefore, he says, the magic of the elixir of life makes use of conscious action in order that unconscious non-action may be attained. Conscious action consists in setting the light in circulation by reflection in order to make manifest the release of heaven. If then the true seed is born, and the right method applied in order to melt and mix it, and in that way to create the elixir of life, then one goes through the pass. The embryo, which must be developed by the work of warming, nourishing, bathing, and washing, is formed, that passes over into the realm of unconscious non-action. So again, I've read this book several times, and just like encountering the reference to the unconscious there in relation to Wu specifically, I think this is what draws Lacan here, is that there's a link, direct link between non-action and the unconscious, right? And it's explicit in the text themselves, so it's not an overreading. Okay. Any thoughts on that? Okay.
It's Yeah. Continue, please.
I'll move on. So the next big one, of course, I think is one that you referenced in on 39. How do you say that, Ayoto?
Xing.
Xing. Kind of like sing, right? Xing.
Yeah. Yeah. Mhm.
So he translated as nature or the way it is. You were referring to it before as also being, in the sense that being is not separate from reality. or from all that is. So it's a really loaded signifier, right? That has ontic resonance.
This is, yeah, I mean, what I was referring to before was the 自然, so that's a different one again. But 性,
Oh, okay. I thought you were
this
referring
is,
to this one.
but here, this is also very interesting because it's also about nature. This is like the kind of, those like memes that where people say, "Hey, how do you say this in French or in
Right.
things?" And,
Ver,
and
ver, ver, ver,
yeah, yeah, this
ver.
kind of thing. So, and it's a very good. Lacan is very shows his level of awareness and depth in terms of his research into Chinese. Because here, Xing, when I first read it, the first thing that comes up is actually for me is sex, like
Mm,
sexuation. But also it's true. It's also here for Confucian thought. It refers to human nature, and in Taoism, it's about the spontaneous natural flow of being.
mm,
But it's in modern Chinese that it's has become linked to sex and sexuality and gender.
mm.
性别 is like the differentiation of 性. So that becomes
Is it
gender.
like Eros, sex drive or something like that?
No,
Okay.
nothing with regards to that. And see that's a very Western way of relating to it, and because
Mm,
the history of this is more connected to just nature
mm.
and being and the natural flow. Um, and so and of course then this is dangerous territory because then the 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 conservatives will say yeah, like nature and so forth, and like your gender is what you're born with or something like that. But I don't think I don't get that connotation here because
Mm,
it's rather about the flow, and there is not the specificity of male and female and so forth. Even the word itself, I forget, the separation, like it doesn't give any of the gender aspect.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
So it has a different history of this, and also it's linked to
mm.
desire and sexuality and human nature. Uh,
Yeah.
so yeah.
When I was asking about the sex drive, it's because in my mind, again, people hear sex drive differently, but in my mind, sex drive just means, or eros, means life drive in the sense that the life force. So it's my way of thinking about it as chi or ki. So that's why I was asking if it's related to that.
Oh no, no.
Okay, no, it's something
Uh,
else. But you said it's related to sexuality in some way, but more to gender.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a modern thing. That's the interesting
Okay.
part. So the word itself, the character, the left side, it's what they call radicals, right? So you have different radicals that is combined to create these words. So the left part of the radical, that's a variant of xin, which is heart. So what your heart, your mind, your emotions, your spirit. And then the right is seng, which is to give birth, to grow, life, indicating life, vitality, and so forth. So that's the kind of how the two radicals combine to create this specific word.
Okay. So I'm gonna move to the next one. He links Sing to Ming, and he says that Mencius in his writing, he writes kind of like a collage style, sort of like a bricolage technique. Things come out of one another, but they don't resemble each other. So alongside the notion of seeing nature, the notion of Ming, heaven's decree, suddenly comes out. Um, and then Lacan says basically the interpretation is that you have nature or that's the way it is. And then the explanation for that is because that's the way it is, right? And that's the way it is because that's the way it is. And so that's a point about how, again, within Confucian logic, there's like a metonymy going from Sing to Ming that says something about the symptom, which is basically what's left over and what's not accounted for. Um, So in a way, he's saying that here's an early example of the symptom um, within this metonymic mechanism that Mencius used. So I think that's fascinating in my view, because he says symptoms orient you, all of you, such as you are. The only things that interest you are the things that assume the appearance of symptoms, but you don't understand them in the least. So that's how the symptom works. You don't understand it. It has to do with that not knowing that we began with. And again, it speaks to the wu, the non-action, the unconscious non-action. And again, all of that is recognized. So this unconscious dimension keeps reappearing within the Chinese characters and the Chinese symbolic order, in other words.
You know, here, I suspect, like for the Chinese, that it's expressed not so much verbatim as a concept of unconscious, right? So, for
Mm,
example, Ming is, directly can be like life, but it's also fate or destiny or decree. So here, the Ming, it's very much it refers to a lot of times it's external structuring forces or the will of heaven.
right.
So it's the Tian Ming, so from the heaven, like heavenly decree. And I think what happens with also going back to even like, bring back the so-called Judeo-Christian
Mm-hmm.
values. And you can see this playing out very much with, let's say, Zionism, but also the evangelical kind of way, so-called secularism. There's a kind of the direction is a kind of essentializing um, kind of way of thinking. And in this way, I think it creates more and more of a separation and segregation for a subject with their unconscious. And in the day-to-day kind of interactions, like I remember when I speak to my parents, especially my mom, a lot of times there is this like the ties they say like sabai sabai or in Japan
Mm-hmm.
they have a different there's like it cannot be helped.
Mm-hmm.
There is a much more
Inshallah in Arabic,
yeah,
right?
inshallah, exactly. And it's very much worked into the daily life. Um, and I think the West could have it can easily translate that or kind of relate to that as if people are naive or backwards or superstitious, right? But I think it's you can see how fundamentally it's structured differently within the language, how
Mm-hmm.
we relate to the so-called unconscious or things that is beyond the ego.
Well, I think too that why Lacan thinks this is genius, this sort of metonymic move, is he's saying that the Chinese basically since ancient times have recognized the dimension of the symptom
Yes.
in this conception. So by saying that's the way it is because that's the way it is, you're referring to something that you don't understand, the symptom, but you know this or it's orienting your desire nonetheless. And so it's a very sophisticated statement. And so I think in this whole section, basically, it's called Against the Linguists. If I were to summarize it, he's basically framing Mencius against the linguists, and the linguists for him are people who are dealing at the level, trying to deal at the level of meta language, of basically trying to think about language from outside of language. And he's saying that that's not possible, and that's why he says there is no meta language. Why he thinks the Mencius approach is better, because it's a recognition of not knowing, unconscious non-action, learned ignorance, if you will. It presents an ultra-modern perspective on the unconscious that recognizes the symptom, but also he says, he talks about obviously the Marxist concept of surplus value or profit as the symptom of capitalism, right? And he talks about surplus jouissance as the symptom of discursive subjectivity. So for him, why he returns to Mencius is because he sees the coordinates of discursive subjectivity and the recognition of the symptom as surplus jouissance. It's all there in the words and in the concepts and in the metonymic displacement.
I think it's helpful in Lacan's position to be able to analyze this, to be in the analyst position of the Chinese language. And it's rare because you require simultaneously quite deep understanding, but also that it's not your mother tongue to make these connections.
So imagine if you attended this in person in 1970 or 1971, he would be going to the board and writing those characters from his mind. And that's how good he was, how proficient. And
Mm.
there would be Chinese people in the audience who can, actually question him or offer like a challenge. And so it wasn't like he's just like one person that knows this. Like it's a different time. It speaks to, I think it speaks to maybe uh, again why I framed it in relation to Said's Orientalism is here's an example of a non-Orientalist approach of how we can,
Yes.
and this is good. This is helpful. This is good. Okay, so moving on. So this is a big one. Writing and truth. He really, and so on the left is what he writes on the board. Again, it's impressive to me that he's writing this on the board from his mind. Um, Lacan seminars, of course, as people might know who are listening or watching, are way better than his writings. He referred to his écrits as publication, as a reference to poubelle and publication at the same time. Poubelle meaning trash, so it's like trashings or so because you're overthinking, right? And at the end of the day, his thing, again, going back to his theory of language, is there's language. Language has effects, and then you have speech. Then writing comes later as a way of trying to think about language. And that's why there is no meta language, because what writing is doing is it's going back to think about language effects through logic and through graphs and all of that. But it's just returning back to the origin, if you will. Um, and so in this chapter, I think it's like really the crux of the book or the seminar. He really unpacks this section from Mencius, but he really hones in on one particular part on page 45, as you can see. That's a section from the one on earlier. He just highlights one bit of it. So I want to talk about that because he unpacks it to understand something about the function of writing. So if you don't mind looking at 45, are you able to unpack that for us, like the characters?
Yeah. 天下之言信也. I need to double check this. Here we go. Yeah, 天下. So first is 天下, heaven, sky,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the 之 is like of, and 言 is of language, so of and of nature, and of the final particle of this sentence. So the speech of heaven is nature, or what is spoken by heaven is human nature. So that's a pretty big implication.
Yeah, so he's translating as what speaks about nature under heaven.
Mhm.
And so the way I kind of unpack this again discursively, I refer to the heaven as kind of the S1, like in the position of semblance or in the position of the agent. And you have language and speech at the bottom of that. So that basically refers to divided subjectivity, the subject divided by language. Um, and then um, and then you have the nature of speaking beings. So what's fascinating again, the reference to nature, going back to this point about nature or ontology or being, he's saying that it's specifically about speaking beings. It's not just any kind of being, but it's about speaking beings. So there's a recognition again of the discursive subjectivity and divided subjectivity within Mencius here. What are your thoughts on that?
I was just thinking about something else because it's about the Tianxia, and this is a big different tangent, but just to kind of
Mm,
bookmark because the question of Tianxia and the Chinese history and let's say the 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 holy courts, because when we speak of Tianxia, are we speaking, what are we actually speaking about? And the heavens, what is the heaven? And again, in English, so English Christian, perhaps when you think of heaven, it's a very different world because the emperor is the helm, right? And there's also the emperor of the universe, and this becomes glaringly problematized in the infamous journey to the west, right, of the
Mm,
Sun Wukong, the Monkey King, and because there is the question of the arrival of Buddhist teachings. And in that story, they incorporate the Tianxia, they incorporate the emperor of the heavens, but it's a separate thing to there's a larger the arrival of the Buddha, and that goes even it's not even above or beyond or who he the Buddha has more authority or power. It's like another dimension, and there's a very much there's a respect to that. Um, and also this question of the Monkey King who was acting out and then got immortal kind of like things and because he went to the heaven and ate the peach and so forth. But so this is all to say that there are for me like the Buddha almost was like an arrival of another of the real. So
mm,
there's the kind of symbolic structures of the emperor and everything under the heavens and so forth. But then arrives something even more unexplicable, the Buddha, and
mm.
the a lot of the new wisdom that is coming from through the translation of the monk and of Buddhism, and how that has began to affect the region. So that's kind of a little bit. I was like tripping and thinking like
Mm.
it is a very big, large world.
I love this point at the bottom of 45 where he says, insofar as it is in the world, insofar as it is under heaven, language is what constitutes sing, nature. So again, language, speech, that's what is behind the nature of speaking beings. So it's a recognition of the symbolic order. It's heaven is a seems like a in the place of a master signifier that's representing the symbolic, and there's a recognition of the realm of language and law, basically as the thing that's structuring um, discursive subjectivity.
Yeah, this is just there's so many implications here. This is very fascinating because let's say for it in the West, right? Like the castration of language and like you have the the press and the Bible, and then you have the Martin Luther and so forth. But then this question of the arrival of holy texts from India, from of Buddhism, and so in a way, is it that the Chinese got castrated by this arrival of more complex or different languages, and I don't know. There's a lot that we don't have time to go into, but even just these things about like the
Mm,
relationship between China and Tibet is also very complex
yeah.
for a very long period of time, and so this like question of language and the symbolic order,
Hmm.
there is so much to still unpack and
And the function of writing, I think that's where he's gonna get it to in a bit. So I want to move to especially 47 here,
yeah.
where he says, on the basis of the speech that is nature, because we said that nature is the nature of speaking beings, or if you will, on the basis of the speech that concerns nature, the point is to arrive at the cause, that would be the objet A, insofar as the said cause is Li. As regards to the effects of discourse, or as regards what is under heaven, what is under the sky, what comes out of this is no other than the function of the cause insofar as it is surplus jouissance. So again, the way I broke it down in schematically in the margins is like heaven is a discourse, a chain of signification. It's basically that's what it refers to, the signifying chain. That's heaven. And below that you have speech, divided subjectivity in relation to nature as the objet, the nature of speaking being the kernel of the subject that thing that you can't say, right? So
Hmm.
it's all there. It's all there. Um, okay. It's fascinating. So moving on to 48, where he kind of breaks down ue, non-action, through the analyst discourse. So he says the analyst discourse is nothing other than the logic of action, right? We can say also, or non-action. That is what makes writing different from speech. Speech has to be added back into it. In order to be understood, writing has to be seriously layered over with speech, but naturally, that cannot occur without theoretical inconveniences. He says it is truly odd. This is a kind of a funny side note. It is truly odd that the person who was literally convulsed by the title of his book, Ekri, was a Japanese woman. But he has this thing about, again, speech before writing, and then writing produces graphs or schemas that are logical ways for dealing with language or speech. It is via speech. This is 49. I'm moving on. I don't have 49 here, so sorry about that. But in 49, he says, it is via speech, of course, that a pathway toward writing is paved. The graphs are comprehensible only as a function, um, I would say, of the least stylistic effect of my Ikri, writings that are, in a sense, stairs that allow access to the graphs. So ultimately, it's a kind of the sequence, speech, writing, graphs, or schemas, right? And what is at stake in is speech, insofar as it tries to pave the way to these graphs. So the relationship to truth that results from what is known as free association. So in other words, um, it is we reach truth, subjective truth through free association, through speaking. That's our nature, the nature of speaking beings. But of course, we can only half say because there's the objet a as the nature, the way it is, right? Um, okay, so he gets into this symbol. Is it C? How do you say that?
Yeah, but
So,
um, this is, hold on, I need to research this because this is like just a radical, um, but please continue. I need some time.
so this one is fascinating because he uses the symbol of S, and he says it means crafty, personal, or private. And he breaks down this character into three parts on figure 4.1. He says at 1, you have the effects of language. That's where you start from. Then you go down. So it's a kind of a point about calligraphy and the logic of the character itself and breaking it down in its complexity. So you start with the effect of language, then you go to the source of power, which is 2, and then you move to 3, which is the fact of writing, which is another way of putting it is to say what is written. So in Arabic, for example, there's this concept of maktub. You see it in Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist. Maktub, what is maktub? What is written? In other words, is to say what is under heaven or what is destiny or what is fate. It's written, right? But what is written is ultimately a questioning through logic of the effects of language. And the effects of so there's kind of a recursive move. It's like a cycle going back to the effects of language. Um, for him, this move from 1 to 2, from the effects of language to the source of power, is the dimension of truth as the big other. So that's how, again, we have heaven representing the signifying chain, right? The S1 to S2 to S3, etc., under which the divided subjectivity can relate to the kernel or the cause of desire, right? The nature. Um, so it's a very elaborate point here, but basically he says writing is not first, but rather second with respect to any, and this is 51, any and every functioning of language. Without writing, it is nevertheless impossible to question anew what results first and foremost from the effect of language as such, in other words, from the symbolic order, that is the dimension of the truth as other. He says also he spells dimension as dimension, meaning of the mansion. To say that dimension of truth as the other has to do with power and has to do with prestige and has to do with buildings and has to do, and I know also like again because I looked at some documentaries about Taoism, like there are like these temples up in the mountains and they're simulating the experience of going to heaven. Like Taoist temples, you go up really a long way climbing up the stairs. Um, and that's the dimension of truth as the other right there, like embodied in this way, right? But ultimately, that's the physical embodiment, but there's a metaphysical dimension about how it structures speech and subjectivity. And that's what he's trying to get at, is it's in the characters themselves and how you draw them and what they do, how they work on a subject. So, any thoughts on this? I know it's pretty loaded.
Yeah, I mean the I think this is the part where it's very Lacan and very French, where this character, I mean this is not a character, this is a if you will, maybe at most a radical, and I've even trying to get AI to like find what else could be, but it's not anything that neither the AI nor me can really find the root of it. So but I go with his reasoning and rationale, and it's maybe not, I don't know, that's but still an interesting way of thinking about it. But for example, there is and then here it can get we can get interesting in terms of genealogy. For example, my uncle, he has a very good, very beautiful piece of work where they write the word dragon in like, I don't know, like 80 different ways over time, right? The different ways that the word has evolved. And as you know, right now we in China they have the most modern contemporary version, which is the simplified. And in Taiwan, there's still the quote unquote traditional, but it's not
Mm,
just these two. There's an ongoing evolution. But there's the question of simplification, because the question is how to educate the masses, because it's such a
mm,
complex writing system
hmm.
that for most history, for most time, people were not able to be literate. And so, there's this kind of very fast evolution that has happened in the last 100 years with the language. So a lot of this is going to be even more and more cryptic and
Yeah.
fuzzy, because we're going to it's and now also even for myself, like when you're writing Chinese, you just do the pinyin and you do it on the keyboard and whatever, and everybody does
Mm,
it that way. So
right.
relation, the connection to the calligraphic
Right.
relationship to the language is also
That's lost. Yeah.
starting to be
And
said.
that's huge.
Yeah, that's a huge thing. We gain something, but we lose something else.
Right. So he says also on 51, questioning the dimension of truth in its dwelling place is something that can only be done via writing, insofar as logic is constituted solely on the basis of writing. So writing for him is like three, and it's basically um it's not language, but that's the dimension that gets confused with meta language because it's something that comes after language. But it's the position from which you can question language. And I guess what's kind of paradoxical about writing is you can question language using logic from the position of writing, uh, and at the same time, writing is an effective language. That's what makes it a paradoxical situation. So he says there can be no logical questioning except on the basis of writing, insofar as writing is not language, right? That is why I stated that there is no such thing as meta language. Writing, even insofar as it is distinguished from language, is there to show us that whereas it is owing to writing that language can be questioned, this is true precisely because writing is not language, but can only be constructed or manufactured on the basis of its reference to language. So again, what is language? Language is the heaven, and writing is under the heaven. Okay, that's his way of saying this. Moving on to the next piece, I think this is the most fascinating part, where he gets into the connection between sexuation and yin yang. Are we good on time? Because I know we're a little over. I
How much
can
more are we looking at?
We're probably gonna try to wrap up the Lacan part and go faster with the other ones.
Okay.
So probably 15, 20 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, let's do that because I know I don't wanna lose it, and it's gonna be a while before I can do this with you again. So
Okay. So I'll try to just highlight the most important parts here. Um, so he gets into like the sexual as a logical effect of writing and why this point about the sexual non-report is kind of a logical problem that has to do with the dimension of writing. Because once you're writing, that's like in a way, acknowledgement of impotence. And sexual difference is basically a writing of this difference. And that's why there's that non-report. But he does acknowledge, he talks about the dimension of strangeness in relation to the yin yang. And what I thought was fascinating about the yin yang, for example, is that the yin, which is the feminine, is first, and then the yang is follows the yin. And whereas with his model, he puts phallic jouissance or masculine jouissance on the left, then now, of course, I know in Chinese, do you go right to left or left to right?
you can do both,
You
but
can
in
go either
general,
direction.
when you speak about the yin and the yang, you generally say the
You
yin.
start with feminine, yeah. So I thought that was interesting that somehow there's the primacy of the feminine already in the ordering there, and that he acknowledges that there's a kind of uh, a more ancient and a more complex formative sexuation. Again, I could say more about it, but I'll try to go faster here. But he goes back to this point about under the heaven again, heaven being the S1 and under being the divided subject. So if you look at kind of the word subject, subject means subject to, as in under, right? And that's the origin of the concept. So I find it again fascinating that it exists there as well. He gets into phallic jouissance and its relation to fantasy. Um, there's a lot there to unpack about castration, having the phallus, the masculine position versus being the phallus, the feminine position. So there's definitely a lot there, but I think one that I want to kind of highlight is when he says this is page 55, which I don't have here. He says rituals and myths are like two sides of the same coin on the condition that the two sides be continuous as in a Mobius strip. So again, if we think about it again discursively, and he talks about the Oedipal myth and the myth of the primal father from Totem and Taboo. If we think about the Oedipal myth as kind of the truth of psychoanalysis, then psychoanalysis, what is it but a ritual that is grounded in this Oedipal truth or the myth of the primal father? So he's saying this again, which I thought was interesting. Um, it's almost like it's a self-critical position. Okay, so let me move to 71. It's very rich, as you can all see. Um, Here he talks about when we study a bit of writing, we always find that it is pronounced as it is because it seems to depict something, right? Writing is the representation of words. So his whole thing here is to say that you have words, again, speech being primary, right? And those words are referring to things that exist in the world, whether they're ideas or actual objects. And what writing does is basically it captures a representation of those words. Um, so he gets a little bit of that into that. He gets into this point about the Chinese being sensitive to tone. He pronounces I in four different ways to show like how you can have different pronunciations of the same exact character, and it means different things. Um, there's a lot there. So I want to kind of move to the other parts just so I can be mindful of time. So we'll say a bit about Francois Chang. Do you want to say a little bit about him?
I was just very, I'm also very new to this, but I was very surprised and also curious and interested in the way that he is redacted or not very much mentioned or skipped over despite his influence. And there was also somebody else that Lacan was learning from, where he got a lot of his knowledge. But this is quite the common thing, right, for Western scholars in history, that we are not told about where their what their sources are, in terms of information and so forth. And so, and yeah, this is I'm really into it, and I'm kind of curious about his
Yeah.
relationship to France, and but also what he's writing. But I need to have more time
Yeah,
to
so I mean,
translate
Francois
it.
Chang is a pretty prolific scholar, and he was an expert in Chinese calligraphy and Chinese paintings. He's written wonderful books in French. Not many of them have been translated. But I wanted to include like some quotes from direct quotes from him so we can get a sense of his thinking. So he says, one day, looking joyful, Lacan told me about his interests for thoughts on the painting of the monk Bitter Gourd, a treatise written by the painter Chitao, 17th century. He wanted to learn more about some notions put forward by this great artist. So Lacan learned a lot about calligraphy from Cheng. In this treatise, Chitao develops his view of a living, changing world and of the accomplishment of the human spirit in this changing. In this context, the artist, through the art of the brushstroke, has the mission of establishing the link between the human soul and the soul of the living universe, bringing together man's drives and the pulse of the world. We started by examining for quite some time the notion of the single brushstroke. On this occasion, Lacan displayed his fascination with Chinese calligraphy. His primary question, how can the brushstroke be the link between man's or woman's becoming and that of the universe? The stroke constitutes a living being with flesh and bones. It must be animated by the breath spirit, like the universe itself. The horizontal stroke, which I've included at the top, standing for the word one, which is the basis for the other strokes, is perceived as the image of the primordial breath separating heaven and earth. So again, my association to this is the bar that's castrating and dividing the subject.
Mm.
Um, but obviously it's much more than that. But like if we kind of be psychoanalytic about it, it's a powerful um, symbolization of the bar, but obviously does much more than that because there's a kind of divine aspect to it, divine jouissance that has to do with the practice itself and the meditative experience of the practice, right? Okay, so this is Francois Chang engaging. He was also a master calligrapher, not just a scholar of calligraphy, but he himself has wonderful works. And I just wanted to highlight some of his works here, like Empty and Full and The Breath Becomes a Sign, Chinese Poetic Writing. Very prolific. I think people need to engage with him more and get over their Eurocentrism and neglect of non-European thinkers and so I'm encouraging folks to go out and again, part of this effort to look at some
Mm.
Chinese Lacanians like Wu Datong, who wrote a
Mm.
book called La Chine sur le divan, China on the Couch, published in 2008 in French, which is interesting too. He
Yeah.
didn't write it in Chinese, right? And his main thesis is that the unconscious is structured like Chinese writing. So this is his revision of Lacan. Lacan said the unconscious is structured like a language, right? That's Lacan. Datong is saying the unconscious structured like Chinese writing, more specifically. And so I have some highlights and I would like you to guide us through them in the next slides. But he says the Chinese language depends much more on writing than inflectional languages such as French, English, German, etc. Now, what interests us here is this, the structure of Chinese writing being more complicated than alphabetic writing. It offers us a key or a new point of view to understand the formation of the unconscious. That is to say, an analysis of the construction of the stenogram can help us to understand the structure of the unconscious, its splitting, and its operations. So again, I don't think Lacan would disagree with him because that's clear from Seminar 18. So do you mind reading this?
The mechanisms of the composition of synograms follow the two major mechanisms of dream work proposed by Freud: condensation and displacement. In this present article, which is the continuation, we want to continue to demonstrate that the different categories of Chinese writing represent the different levels of the unconscious, and this is therefore structured like Chinese writing. In the previous text, we proposed the following diagram to schematically express the trigonal relationship that exists between the sound, acoustic image or signifier, the figure, visual image or visual signifier, and the signified of the Chinese character, see figure 1. A concrete example of the tree pictogram, which can be written like this, see figure 2. The horizontal line at the top of this character represents the branches, the two inclined lines at the bottom, the root and the vertical line in the middle, the trunk. That is to say that the tree pictogram is like an abstract drawing of the tree. The relationship between the figure of the character and the signified object, tree, or more precisely, the visual image of this object in the memory, is a relationship of morphological similarity, which is opposed to the arbitrary relationship between the sound and the object, or more precisely, between the signifier and the signified.
So the tongue here is kind of revising Ferdinand de Saussure's theory of linguistics, structural linguistics, which is the basis for Lacan's theory of the unconscious. And he's doing this obviously through looking at Chinese characters and providing a very rigorous analysis and he continues. So if you don't mind, I'll let you take over the Datang section.
If we place this schema in the framework of Jacques Lacan's teaching, we can say that the system of the signified belongs to the order of the real, the phonetic system, to the order of the symbolic, and that of the figure of the sinogram, to the order of the imaginary. We therefore have another following schema, see figure 3. This means that the relationship between the order of the real and that of the imaginary is a relationship of similarity, or that of metaphor. The relationship between the imaginary and the symbolic, and that between the real and the symbolic, are a relationship of contiguity, or that of metonymy. That is to say, by taking a concrete example concerning the trigonal relationship of Chinese writing, we can give an empirical interpretation to the Lacanian typological theory of three orders of the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary.
So there's a little bit at the bottom there.
We must assume that there exists first a disjointed state of these three independent orders, which is the deepest basis of the structure of the unconscious. As the psychic system evolves, these three orders begin to link together. This connection constitutes the second stage of our unconscious.
So he has a very complex theory of, different, kind of like the complexity of the Chinese language mirrors the complexity of the Chinese unconscious. In other words, there's
Yes.
it's layered, it's multi-layered in a way that's hard to imagine for, let's say, an English speaker, a native English speaker. And he tries to really explain it empirically, all these levels um, of complexity, if you don't mind.
At the level of writing, the phenomenon that a single sound represents many sinograms was expressed through borrowings. These resulted from the break that occurs between pictograms and their signifiers. When the link between the two was cut, the figure of the character as a full representation became the empty representation. That is to say, the pictograms became the phonetic writing that now represents only the sound, not the meaning. Indeed, the borrowings of Chinese writing belong to a crude syllabogram. We know well that in the evolution of Western writing, it is also the break occurring between pictograms and their signifiers, which forms the basis on which the Egyptian pictograms finally became the Hellenic alphabetic writing. From a psychoanalytic point of view, the rupture between the figure of the sinogram and the sound signifies the rupture that occurs between the imaginary order and that of the symbolic. One of the consequences of this rupture is the arbitrary manifestation of visual representations that is at the origin of the hallucinatory vision, one of the psychotic symptoms. That is to say, the ideogram of Chinese writing corresponds to the state of visual hallucination of psychosis.
He's saying a lot there. Any thoughts, any associations to the Tong's theory so far?
Yeah, I think it's very evident, no? Like, and also like if we look at the difference between the Chinese logocentric system versus the alphabetic phonetic systems. And this is also, I think this is also the part where these things, I get the sense a lot of times when we're, a lot of these concepts that is being discussed on this part in Western groups, it seems so obvious from the Chinese side because that is the way it is. And also the fact that, for even today in China, that in the different regions, you'll share the same writing system, but you cannot understand each other on the level of this of the speech.
Hmm.
And this
A breakdown of the signifying chain, in other words.
right, but the signifiers have remained relatively constant for thousands of years through different oral traditions, through different conquerors and so forth. You can see that how even in Japan and Korea, they still maintain a lot of these Chinese signifiers. And so I think this is something that is very difficult um, to understand for those coming from alphabetic
Hmm.
phonetic systems.
Okay, we're near the end here. I'm gonna skip some parts, but I wanted to again encourage people to check out the Tong's work because I know you're running out of time. But he goes into like very empirical examples, like the symbol for Ma,
Right.
um, how it's composed of two pictograms, and then the left one is the pictogram of a woman, and the right one the pictogram of a horse, right? And then there's the two pentagrams also include three elements: the figure, the sound, and the signified, right? So uh, he gets into the complexity of the representation and what that says again about the Chinese unconscious. And he breaks it down in this way: figure sounds, figure sounds. Um, so we don't have a lot of time to go into it in details,
But
but again,
hold
I
on,
encourage folks. Yeah,
could you go back about the mother thing
yeah.
because the, that's wait a second, that's not really the mother, but that's what character is this? Um, that's really strange because that's not the
That's
that's a
directly
different
from that tongue. Yeah.
right. I wonder what he's referring to because here, yeah, it's a new colloquial. That's funny because that's a modern thing because the ancestral word is a totally different word.
Hmm.
Um, and here's the other thing because this is simplified Chinese, and
Hmm.
I think as you know, depending on the emperor or different like decree, like the language gets changed. So there, it's a very different pictograms that is used in Taiwan or even Japan or Korea versus what is the new simplified ones in China. But this is news to me as well, and
Hmm. Hmm.
um, I just want to double check this because I'm just like, because I'm thinking like that's so funny. Like, you know, the mother and the horse. You know, I can think already terrible misogynistic kind of
Hmm.
implication,
Hmm.
but that's not at all.
That's not where he's going with it, though.
So here, the history of this shift. That's really fascinating. But
He gets also to like the left figure, right sound idea to talk about the brain hemispheres as well. The left brain as a
right,
language brain processes language information coming from the
yeah,
right of the field of vision, And then that is the information of the phonetic sound from the right of the audio phonogram. So that's interesting too.
That is very interesting. Yeah, this is a lot to unpack. And
It's a lot. It's heavy. That's why I'm sorry if I'm going a bit fast here, but this requires its own lecture.
yeah,
But I wanted to acknowledge him because it would be weird to just talk about Lacan and not acknowledge Chinese Lacanians, right?
it's amazing.
So I wanted people to know that this work is out there. They can read it. It's mostly in French, but um, but if you don't mind reading that part, that's from him as well.
Considering this symbolic, which is related to language as a system of signifiers, as one of the registers of the unconscious clashes with Freudian thought, according to which the unconscious only includes representations of things. It is only that the system of the preconscious conscious includes representations of things and also representations of words. Now, if we consider the thought at the end of Jacques Lacan's life, according to which the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary are treated as three circles which are intertwined in such a way that the rupture of one leads to the unbinding of three, it is obvious that this intertwining of three registers must be considered as an intertwining which operates first at the level of the unconscious. That is to say, with regard to Freudian thought, a very important step taken by Jacques Lacan is that he made us notice that the link which is found between the representation of thing and the representation of word, or between the signified and the signifier, is without doubt an unconscious link. Our model of the triple unconscious structure, which is based on the structures of Chinese writing and its four categories of characters, can be considered as an empirical model of the Lacanian topological model on the three orders of the real, symbolic, and the imaginary.
So his model has like a three tripartite unconscious structure, which again, I think more people should pay attention to it. So I'm almost done here. I have a couple more slides. Just wanted to acknowledge my friend Fu Wai regarding the question of non-psychoanalysis. And it's worth referencing Francois Laruelle's concept of non-philosophy here as a comparison, an approach that challenges philosophy's claim to be the highest or most fundamental form of knowledge, or university discourse in Lacan's words. It asserts that reality exists independently of philosophical interpretation, that's non-philosophy, and should not be reduced to philosophical concepts. Non-philosophy brackets traditional philosophical thought, offering a way to engage with reality without imposing philosophical structures on it. I thought that this aligned really well with what Fu Wai tries to do. So I asked the question, why is Lacanian psychoanalysis non-psychoanalysis? This is an alternative reading to the return to Freud theory, which touches the traumatic real via the paradoxical logic of Gongsun Long. And so Lacanian psychoanalysis, and can I following the logic of the sort of the way that text is structured, which is kind of dialogical. So there's a question and an answer. The question is, Lacanian psychoanalysis is not psychoanalysis? Yes. Why? Because Lacanian psychoanalysis is a particular method within psychoanalysis whose focus on structural linguistics and anthropology, algebra, and topology makes it distinct from traditional psychoanalysis. Lacanian psychoanalysis, in other words, does not fully align with the general category of psychoanalysis as defined by Freud and others. So this is using Chinese logic, paradoxical logic, to negate Lacanian psychoanalysis here and to think of it as a form of non-psychoanalysis. This is grounded this concept of white horse is not horse. And again, Fu Wai was telling me that you don't have articles in the Chinese characters, so it wouldn't be. It's often mistranslated as a white horse is not a horse, but I think the literal translation is white horse is not horse, right? And so there are no
But even
articles.
it, I
Yeah,
think
go
it can
ahead.
be even more simpler, not even is not. It's just uh
Not
not.
right. White horse, not horse. So there are no articles in the Chinese language, and there was no punctuation in ancient Chinese. The same character could denote its verb form, adjective form, and adverb form. That possibility, I think, opens up all this metonymic symptomatic possibilities, right, in subjectivity. Could at the same time mean the concept, the essence, and the member, for example, ma, horse. And that's, I think, what Datong was referring to, can represent horse, the category, a horse, the member, horseness, to ride a horse, and to regard something as belonging to the category of horse. So a white horse is not a horse is a mistranslation in this sense. And the lack of article signifies, in my opinion, maybe the ambiguity of the real. Um, so that's how I read that. Now, this is the final slide. I don't know if you're familiar with his work, Guanjun Wu.
No.
So he wrote this really cool book called The Gray Dragon Fantasy, a Lacanian analysis of contemporary Chinese thought, published in 2014. And he says Lacan studied ancient Chinese classics assiduously, including Tao Te Ching and Mencius during 1969 to 1973, when his own thought was reaching maturity. Lacan's idiosyncratic interpretation of Mencius is often regarded as a simple misreading, but Wu defends Lacan's reading by treating it as a psychoanalytic reading, which further develops a reinterpretation of ancient Chinese thought by revisiting primarily two major disputes, Mencius versus Junji, Confucianism versus Taoism, through a Lacanian interpretive method. The research findings reveal the possible latent side of ancient Chinese thought that has substantially formed what Lacan called the Chinese unconscious. So this is kind of like a great effort into thinking about the Chinese unconscious by a Chinese Lacanian. Um, so I kind of wanted to leave it with that to acknowledge the work done by Chinese scholars today. So any final thoughts or associations?
Well,
We
Robert,
come
I
to
mean,
the end here.
I I I think back and link back to the very beginning of what's his name? Mayor Rob or Bob or whatever his name is, about that China is the new Islam.
Oh, Bill
And
Maher, yeah.
Bill Maher. and and I think that's such a great quote. I think it's very precise, as beyond the racist part, of course.
Yeah.
Uh, in that, like, it's similarly how the West has over thousands of years repeatedly eliminated, hidden the Islamic influences and all the things, but also how it required Islam to forward a lot of its thoughts and ideas. And here with Lacan, that it's very fascinating the cult of Lacan that he inspires in people today. But as you have provided today in this lecture, that can be expanded into a whole lifetime of work, and people can go and hopefully and create the curiosity. Is also similar to the how the society is happening right now, right? Like the continuation and the forwarding of any kind of research and idea requires this internationalism, and very much so a big part of it in China and with the Chinese. And the Chinese are ready because they are able to speak Western languages, and they're involving themselves with all of the technology that the West has provided. But the West is completely stubborn and unable. I think there's a limitation. There's it's not even a question of will. I think it's for many people, it's simply because of this asymmetry of power for such a long time. I mean, who has the ability and the capacity and the time, uh, like Lacan, to dedicate himself to different modes of language? But the crazy thing is that there are plenty of Chinese people around that are willing to have this dialogue. So I think not
Mhm.
just the implication, of course, we're here nerding out on Lacanian psychoanalysis, but I think the implications of this is really, you can see the same recursivity in every other field, really, that is happening.
Mm.
I think that's what's so exciting, and time to be a sinologist, and to really explore that avenue.
I hope that I convince people that Zionism is the solution. And also, another way of rephrasing Bill Maher is to say China is the new other. But I would say that China is the old other, has always been the other.
Has
So
always been
there's
there.
nothing new about that, right?
Newness is just their limited scope and their limited memory of history, and their essentialization of knowledge and wisdom and the universe, really. But and I will leave this other big aspect that I do think is important, that this question also on the signifier of the indigenous,
Mm,
I think is very is also a typical trap for especially Western liberals, I think, where
mm,
it's not to say that there is not the importance, and I think this is something that the Westerners, the settler colonialists, has to reckon with, right? With all of their issues of colonization and genocide,
mm,
elimination of indigenous knowledge, but to not get lost in, because it's the two sides of the same coin, right? The Bill Maher versus the liberal person who's very fetishizing the indigenous. It's actually the same thing, which is just one is from a hate and one is a philic and a
mm,
phobic kind of way, but neither is actually allowing the other to speak and to be castrated by the other, where
mm,
and the same thing I think must and be said and criticized also, because we can observe the same thing as what is happening in Xinjiang with the Chinese, right? It's not to the same extent and it's not the same format, but it's something that it's important to understand, because I think the biggest problem with anybody and any power is that the desire for essentialization and refusal to let the other speak.
mm.
I think that's something that psychoanalysis provides very a great reminder for.
Right. The indigenous fantasy, but also moving beyond xenophobia and xenophilia toward the Mencius approach of learned ignorance and not knowing, which is how we kind of approach the topic today. It's like basically showing that there's a lot of complexity. There's a Chinese real. There's a lot that we don't know, but it's still worth engaging, nonetheless. And
And there's
that's
a lot that we do know that we don't know that we know, right? Like
right, right, right.
and it's just because, and I think this is what's really crazy these days is that we have so much technology,
Right,
but a lot of people remain at a position of like a psychotic position of like a total foreclosure
right.
of wisdom. And that's really
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the thing that we must reject is this I think like the Bill Maher statement is a negation of Chinese modernity. It's a negation of Islamic modernity. And that is the exact thing. That's a colonial position. That's what coloniality does. It just negates any kind of different modernity that threatens it. And
right.
as you said, the indigenous fantasy is basically what I would describe as anti-modernity. It's
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not the solution to coloniality. The solution is to actually search our traditions and find these alternative modern interpretations. And that's, I think, what we tried to present today.
Beautiful. Thank you, Robert.
No, thank you for being part of it. And of course, this will be posted on my channel, and you're free to post it on your channel as well.
I think it's a great resource, and I hope people follow up and read a lot of your books. And I'm looking forward to your final part of your trilogy, and also all these a lot of great recommendations I'm going to get into over the next period.
Awesome.
All right.